Yeah.
Okay, the camera's started. I now say John Wayne was the greatest actor ever.
I see Donald has got his hand up, so let's start with Donald. Go ahead, man.
I wanted to start this episode by talking a little bit about ancient versus medieval things. Just some things that had occurred to me after last week.
Please do.
That we have some comment. I wanted to take up two things. First, human nature.
Yes.
We've talked about Kenneth and his existentialism versus you're either existential or deluded. And
I suggest you keep away from human nature. It's bad for your health.
No, I'm not. Gosh, I don't know how to respond, Stephen. But anyway, I mean, we've talked about that there is a human nature. The fact that Kenneth Smith recognizes a persistent human nature is sort of unusual for an existentialist. It's a bit, but we have a nature, but we learn about it through existing. That's how we gain knowledge about it. And the medieval world took up human nature in an essential way, not an existential way, an essentialist way, in that we all have a human nature, and it was all given to us by God, and we've got the same one.
Right.
And it's not so good at explaining the actual variety of human experience, but I guess it works, and works for them. And then associated with this is natural law. That in Kenneth Smith, these things that we've been saying, we haven't called them natural laws. The arche are sort of natural laws. These infinities that are infinite everywhere, sort of, are the laws that govern existence, the organism of existence. And the medievals, they had something they called natural law too.
Right.
To back up a bit, the Greeks talked about phusis, as laws could be either from phusis, law according to phusis, by phusis, or law according to nomos, or convention, or man. So the Greeks had a natural law more in the sense of what Kenneth does. But the medievals, they don't have to actually, they have natural law too. And we see this a lot as a hangover into modernity in natural law theory, that somehow, God gave us these natural laws. Heck, they're written down. We can read them. They're not something we have to actually be a living organism to discover or experience natural laws. They're given to us. And this was going somewhere, and I didn't quite get to where it was all going, but I just wanted to, this was sort of a kind of a follow-up on how we're seeing the same, not the same concepts, the same words rolling forward in time with their meanings changing, and often changing quite dramatically. And that's enough. I'll go back to sleep now.
No, it's an excellent point, and I think over the course of today's seminar and the next few weeks, we're gonna continue delving deep into these comparisons and contrasts, because it's what this book is all about. Is getting us to understand that it's really not possible to have a philosophical discussion that gets anywhere unless we start by understanding that we are not arriving at our thoughts ex nihilo. We are not little gods who have thought these things for the first time in completely original ways, but instead we are social and cultural beings who have been marinating within a specific epoch of history and the kinds of cultures and worldviews that it supports, and that epoch has inherited its ideas from previous epochs, either willingly by embracing them, or unwillingly by rejecting them and then being stuck with kind of fragments of them that survive anyway, despite our best efforts to stamp them out. And so we're in this, whenever we want to talk about the deeper issues of life, we have this problem that there's an enormous unconscious freight that comes along with what we say, most of which we're not aware of unless we study the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history. It's part of what makes this book interesting, is it gives us some framework for figuring out what we're aligning ourselves with that might be bigger than the conversation that we're having.
Yeah, to kind of jump ahead, where I thought about going,
yeah, please,
was from medieval, with this concept of human nature being an essentialist thing given to us. The choice then gets presented in modernity as either we have this essential human nature, God-given, put it in us wherever, and the alternative with our, as you all have talked about, our law of excluded middle, no human nature. We didn't roll back to some concept of human nature that not only gives rise to multiple personality types like in the ancients, or character types, and not only that, but they give rise, a human nature that can give rise to all the character types in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in modernity. We don't, so like that. But increasingly the modern choice is there is no human nature. And this is associated typically with the existential view, which of course we associate also with Kenneth, but it is sort of a delusional existentialism, if we want to talk about, or it's the ex nihilo existentialist, that in living we create ourselves from nothing. I'll say something ugly about Sartre again or whatever, but or you can just, I don't even care about Sartre, but but there are these. The first existentialists that I was ever exposed to in school were the sort of, by our own will, from nothing, we create our character.
Right.
And that was existentialism. But that's only existentialism, I think, as it goes through this moderation to where we get to the point where we either have to have a fixed, eternal, God-given human nature, or the alternative must be nothing. We don't have one.
Right.
So, gosh, that sounds all very Hegelian.
Yeah, this is good material. We're gonna work over this. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh yeah, I suppose it was brought up, and I suppose the existentialists made the point that, relatively speaking, obviously there is a human nature. There's a series of human facts. Put them in a zoo enclosure with a few trees or something, and see if they climb up the trees and steal a few coconuts, whatever. They'll probably do that. So that demonstrates there is a degree of human nature, but it's the subjectivity which is the huge question. And that is, animals seem to be scripted. They're following intensely a particular program, and they're not going to diverge greatly from that program. Humans seem to be unscripted, and I would say humans are a bit like one of those old wooden gunships. You've got all the rows of cannons, quite a lot of weight in the cannons. If you don't tie them down, they get, particularly in rough weather, they're going to roll all over the place. And as I look at human spirit in terms of politics, they seem to be like one of these ships with loose cannons. The cannons are rolling all over the place. And so you got Germany, which goes from one extreme historically to the other. Yeah, that's really sensible, you know, and this seems to be an aspect that human nature is a loose cannon in terms of some of its subjectivity. And yeah, and that seems to be a measure of its history, and it's frightening.
Yeah.
And this was Aristotle's point as well, that man is a mimic. He will mimic other scripts. Of course, we do see mimicry in nature, but not in the way we see in humans.
Right. Yeah, we want to become, we not only can become other animals in acting, but we want to. You know, you start in any room, if you start doing an imitation of an animal and it's good enough, at least one other person will join you and they'll want to do it too. There's something in us that really gets a buzz from the artistry of recreating the world.
Well, the great outstanding example of mimicry went the other way in Lucifer's desire to mimic God.
Right. Yeah, good point.
So, you know, in Christian, well, Judeo-Christian philosophy or whatever, that man fell due to a being who wanted to mimic the all-powerful. And the world's full of them today. It's full of egos who think they're gods.
The great irony of modernity is that we take our example more from Satan than from Jesus or God, because we believe that the will is divine and that we can choose, and that if we all get together and choose what it is that we want the world to be like, it will be good. You know, ipso facto, the mere exercise of the will results in goodness. And we never say it that way because it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but we act that way. And of course, that's showing the deeper, less rational belief system at work in us. So yeah, it's a good point, Stephen. Phil, go ahead.
It seems to me that Heidegger addressed this. And he did say, you know, at the beginning, he did say that Dasein was thrown into the world, thrown into chaos. So therefore, I guess will, or what he would call resoluteness, will allow you to move through the chaos. But then he revised that, and he talked about the fact that there is a circular motion. I presume he meant culture, that in a sense, you're thrown into a circle. So you're not thrown into chaos, you're thrown into a whirlpool. And that whirlpool then, in a sense, takes you somewhere, and that Dasein must struggle in some ways against the whirlpool, but he's always carried with the whirlpool. And I want to make that transition to, you know, I want to bring up St. Anselm's The Ontology of God.
Sure.
Which is interesting. I mean, it's been a long time, but I suddenly remember this.
Yeah.
And, you know, it seems to me by the time Anselm came along, the question of ontology had been settled, I guess, between Heraclitus and Parmenides. When Parmenides says being is, And so therefore, in a sense, that was picked up to a certain degree by Augustine. God is, and he created everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so Anselm was interesting because ontology, which followed this circle, this pattern, in which, in a case in which metaphysics has created what I would call equal 2
Mm-hmm.
against equal 1, that it has carried itself to such a degree that you're consumed in this already predestined ontology of the circular pattern of equal 2. And he said, and his proof was that God is by nature all powerful, all knowing, well, in many ways, in all ways, all perfect. So for God to be perfect, he must exist because being is. I mean, it wouldn't be perfect if God did not exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if you follow that argument, if you accept that the ontology was already settled, that being is, which is far superior than not being,
Mm-hmm.
nothing, then in a sense it necessarily follows that God is. That's all there is to it. There's no more argument once you're in the circle, the whirling pool of this sort of culture that's already settled that question, presumably, except it's, of course, not quite subtle in my mind, but nonetheless, it was subtle. So you bought into that. I remember when I was in college, when I first heard that, and I was obviously already in the whirling circle, I said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That is actually almost an absolute proof, because it's a proof by definition, right, that it is. And so, but the problem I have with it, if God is perfect, then you could say, how come there's all this imperfection in the world? Did God not make it? Mm-hmm. And you could perhaps argue back and say, well, he knew that all along, and that it's going to be settled in what I would call, I'm purposely misusing the word, the final solution, right? Which is the last judgment. You will pay for your thought of apparent freedom to do what the hell you want, right? Mm-hmm. That is, and so I was thinking, like, God, is God like actually the extreme version of Nazism, the final solution, right? I mean, like, okay, you are misbehaving, you are gone. And so I said, well, if St. Anselm is going to take us to the final solution, then I'm not so sure if I like St. Anselm after all. I mean, that proof, I just have to bring that up. In some sense, it's like the ultimate proof turns out like, well, at the very least, I'm not going to totally reject it. At the very least, I have some doubts about, it seems like the last judgment is even more terrifying than the final solution of the Nazis, right? You will not only pay in death, you will suffer. It would be like the Nazis, before they die you, they want to actually torture you endlessly until you beg for death. I mean, it's like, whoa, is that the God I actually want, who's all powerful, all goodness, and who is being is real? I'm not so sure, So therefore, in a sense, I am not totally rejecting that, but I'm saying, oh, wait a minute, I'm not going to take that proof on his face for sure. So that's my thought about thrown us into the whirlpool. The whirlpool will suck you down if you don't swim hard enough.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to take us back to the text. We launched with Donald's interesting introduction, and the themes that he raised and that Stephen and Phil have talked about are going to come up over and over because of this text. It's all of this discussion is relevant, but I want to center us on it because there's a there's a through line in this section that introduces the medieval world that I find particularly interesting, and I think you will too, where he is essentially saying that the modern conception of will, human will, as the most important thing, is actually set up during the medieval epoch. And I'd like to explore that with you, because one of the themes that we've had come up over and over in these discussions is this idea that if we're talking about different epochs of history, we're not saying that there is the law of the excluded middle between them. We're not saying that there is a moment when they changed over from becoming one kind of thing to some other alien kind of thing. We're saying they grow out of each other, and that they grow out of each other not arbitrarily through accident, but out of necessity, because the strengths of a new epoch in its revolution against the old epoch eventually become its weaknesses. This is a core of Hegelian philosophy of history, that the things that were set in motion in the beginning to liberate you from the old epoch eventually become your chains. And as part of that, it also means that, when you're pushing away from a previous epoch, you're also taking a lot of it with you that you aren't thinking about, that you aren't aware of. And sometimes the things that you take away with you might become even a central feature of the new epoch, but you tell yourself that you invented it. Nobody's ever done this before. We're doing this for the first time. And you do the scapegoating trick because you have to push off of the old era. They did everything wrong, but we're going to do it right. And in so doing, it gives you a feedback loop to try to suppress recognition of the good things that you're carrying forward or the bad things that you're carrying forward from the previous epoch. So modernism believes that it's the first truly democratic era. We might talk about democracy in Athens, but we never do that without also talking about slavery, right? Because we want to make sure we push off. They weren't really doing democracy. I mean, we're sort of modeling ourselves on them, but we're better, right? We're more advanced, we're more scientific, we're more objective, blah, blah, blah. So what I find interesting is that Pico della Mirandola's beautiful human will that we will use to avoid the corruption of nature and the corruption of God by appealing to just doing the right thing, talking together reasonably, and coming up with a solution and implementing it together, that actually begins in the medieval epoch. The importance of that begins in the epoch. In the second page about the medieval era, the second paragraph about the medieval era.
Okay, could we have that reference? I'm not sure because I follow that page system that's on the net.
Right. So this is in the section called Introduction, Time, History, and Nature. And in that section, it's broken into three parts. An introduction, then ancient, then medieval, then modern, and we're in medieval. And the second
which page is that?
I'm gonna have to go and let me bring the browser back up and look at your copy so I could see it. This came from Meetup.
You've got some sort of a PDF, have you?
I do, because I'm working on editing it. So this is the N02.php, Time, History, and Nature. And if you scroll down past the header that says ancient into the header that says medieval, the second paragraph, which begins, the Jews had grasped well how different this new God was from the divinities of their neighbors.
Okay, this is the 02.php, is it?
Yeah, N02.php. I'll put the link in the chat. This is the one that we're going through. And we finished the intro, we finished the ancient section. We're now working on the medieval section.
Oh, okay, so the Jews had grasped how different this new God was.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So that's the paragraph. And a couple of sentences into that, he says, where ancient peoples understood they were bound congenitally by birth or nature to their various religions, the Jews grasped the relation of God and man as a willed and moral covenant or compact, a willed and moral covenant. And then he says, made in his image, man is definitively different from animals. The doctrine imago Dei, image of God, does not mean that finite man resembles infinite God, which, by the way, is the most common misreading of it by moderns. We say, oh, well, okay, so he had 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, all those things. But rather that he reflects in a limited measure the remarkable world-spawning powers God demonstrated in creating the world ex nihilo. What he then goes on to say in the sentences that follow, he's exploring that the image that resembles God is our will. Our spirit resembles God's spirit. God has an infinite version of what we have in a finite quantity. The capacity to imagine the world different from the way it is, to will changes into existence, and then to take the actions necessary to make them happen. That is what it is that we reflect in God. Not that we have 5 fingers, not that we have white skin, but that we will. And the importance of will is developed over the paragraphs that follow until we come to, where is it? The argument that he's making is that previously man's place in the world was not chosen, right? Under the ancient epoch's view of the relationship between nature, God, and man, people find themselves in the middle of the story. We didn't get to write it. And we find ourselves subject to nature and subject to God's. And there is an enormous amount that we don't get to choose. We are entirely at the mercy of all these great archai that are more powerful than we are. There is an enormous burden of pathos, of suffering, meant not as pain, but rather as things that we don't get to choose, things that we don't get to will, even if they're a good pathos, even if it's some of the good things of nature and that the gods give us. Under the ancient worldview, an enormous amount of that is not by our choice. You know, why does food taste good to us? We don't get to choose that. It's just given to us. We suffer it as a pathos instead of as a choice. And what the medieval God does, the monotheist God, is transform those relationships so that rather than being subject to an enormous array of complicated and interpenetrating forces, all of which we're subject to, and which are too complicated for us to understand, the medieval God says, no, I'm the only arche. There aren't any other arche. I made all of it. None of it is making itself. None of it is binding you. All of it is just me. So you only have one thing. Instead of having to learn a myriad or infinite number of things, you only have to learn one thing, and that's me. And if you learn me and what I want you to do in this simple worldview, then you will be liberated from what you thought were the chains of all of the worldliness, because you will discover that none of that is actually an authority. Only I am. They actually can't control you. And you might say, oh no, but the tiger could kill me and eat me. So, how can you say that it won't control me? And what happens is that God sets up this premise that says, but this life doesn't matter. It's the next life that matters, because this life is finite and the next life is infinite. And if you make the right choice now, then your infinity will be a good infinity. But if you make the wrong choice now, then your infinity will be a bad infinity. And so everything hinges, and by the way, none of this would be fair if you were born with a character that prevented you from making the right choices. So unlike the old gods who said that you were subject to your own born character, like as a daimon, as a kind of god that ruled over you, that you were subject to, under the new schema of the medieval worldview, you are liberated from all, of course, they rephrase it, demons. No demons are binding upon you anymore, including your own character, which means you have the capacity to make any choice. Under the ancient worldview, you only had the capacity to make the choices that the current condition of your character would drive you to make. But under the medieval view of human nature, you can make, at any time, you can make any choice. You're infinitely free to choose. And therefore, that means you can choose God, and God will save you from all of these things, and you get to live in eternal bliss. There's nothing stopping you from making that choice, which means everything comes down not to character, but to choice. It comes down to will. Character is nothing. You've been freed from character by Jesus and by God and by everything else. By monotheism, character doesn't matter, but will does. Choice matters. And if you make the wrong one, we'll torture you forever, for eternity. So make the right one, because everything's writing on it. So you see what happens here. Under the ancient schema of the world, your choices are limited. And if you make the wrong choice, it might not be your fault. You might have been born that way. Someone might need to educate you and help you to grow out of, or to help you develop your character to the point that you would be capable of making the right choice. But under the new medieval schema of human nature, there's no such thing as character, right? God gave the gifts to everybody. And if you make the wrong choice, it's because you deserve to be tortured forever. You chose the wrong thing for your, God didn't do that. God gave you free will. You could have chose the right thing, but you chose the wrong thing. And therefore, human will and human choice becomes the single most important thing in human life, because it's the thing that determines the distinction between eternal reward or eternal damnation. The medieval epoch invented the modern conception of infinite free will. It didn't exist before that. And they invented it because they needed it. The entire theology of an infinitely powerful, infinitely good, monotheistic creator of the cosmos ex nihilo only works if human will is deified to such an extent, inflated to be a godlike thing. And if human character is then shrunk down to a nothing that has no binding upon you. If you don't do both of those things, then there's nothing fair about the theology of heaven and hell and eternal life. It had to happen. It was a necessary component of the medieval theology. So I'm going to open it up to questions and comments, but I wanted to start with that because it's so striking that what we find in here is Pico della Mirandola's modern will kind of built into the framework of salvation to such an extent that the salvation needed to invent the modern conception of the will, but kept it leashed to God, which set themselves up for the point at which, when the modern revolution happened and they overthrew God, we were left with a godlike will that had been created by the medievals, which therefore you could see how that could be worth worshiping, because that's where, all that has been inflated to apocalyptic scales now. And so if it's got those kinds of powers, if it has the power to determine whether you're, get eternal reward or eternal damnation, then surely it has the power to help you decide what the right law is to do and what the right kind of economy is to do, and, who counts as human and who doesn't. Stephen, then Sharon, then Joseph, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the issue of the final solution. This is a point I've made before.
Yes.
I've noticed that we live in a market society. It's a society everywhere that's on about the solutions. There's all these companies now running around. They've got their billboards up. We are the solution. So can we get together and create a new sensation called the final solution? But this is it. This is the thing I noticed with modern society, is the love of answers.
Yes.
This is the thing Douglas Adams points out in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that, hey, did you guys really understand the question? You won't understand the answer unless you understand the question, but modern society is bypass this. I think I was rereading page 3 again, and I would point out one of the problems with modern society is, and it makes a lot of decisions based upon this,
yes,
is it's shallow. It's become shallow. There's a lot of stuff at a very superficial level. I think this is the thing Smith was trying to point out. When modern society laughs at the ancients, it's doing so out of superficiality.
Yes.
It's not really digging at what was in the ancients. entertaining philosophy teaches me that I'm not as smart as I like to think I am.
So say we all about ourselves. That's what the job of philosophy is, to help us temper that.
Well, I'm scared now because I see the newspapers full of people with their little ideas, thinking they can apply these ideas with the help of machinery and mechanisms on the mass scale. So we're back on the ship. There's a loose cannon. The loose cannon says, "Whee! I think I'll sail across the entire gun deck, smash out the back and sink into the depths."
Yes.
So we're living in a society that thinks the application of will without thought, without deep thinking, is desirable. Let's go somewhere. Let's enjoy ourselves. So that's the big question. Solutions, the desire for answers without understanding the question.
Yes.
And the superficiality that Smith seems to be referring to at great lengths in the modern.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yeah, you can see it. There's a way in which there's a very Roman quality of modernism. You know, the Romans believed that philosophy was dangerous and that you shouldn't think unless it is about something practical. They want to know, what problem are you solving? And if you're not solving a problem, then you're being impractical and you don't deserve to be free. You deserve to be a slave. And Cicero says this when he's writing about ethics. He apologizes at the outset of his book on ethics for writing about ethics. He says, I know it seems like I'm doing philosophy and that would be wrong, but I assure you there are practical reasons. We can solve practical problems with this, and therefore it's okay. It's like it's so baked into the Roman way to not think too much and to just see a problem, solve a problem, see a problem, solve a problem. You can see why a society like that would be militaristic, and you could see why a militaristic society like that would like that philosophy of problem solving. They go hand in hand. They reinforce each other. We did the same thing as moderns, right? We don't need nature. We don't need God. We don't need character. All we need is free will. We will get together and we will choose the future. You know, we'll see a problem, we'll solve a problem. We'll see a problem, we'll solve a problem. Don't think too hard, or else you're just, you know, you're going to make it hard to talk to other people. And talking to other people is how you build coalitions and win your votes and so forth. So don't be too
the conflict between Pelagius and Augustine here. Pelagius comes to Rome, sees everyone behaving in a manner he thinks is beneath Christian dignity.
Right.
And the Romans say, oh, no problem. We all get forgiven. And so Pelagius doesn't like that idea and says, no, what you do matters. But you're arguing against that. You know, you can have that last, I can choose God. I can do all the wrong things, but I can still choose God, and bang, I go to heaven.
Right. And that's been a central debate in Christianity since its inception, because either answer causes problems depending on the structure of the theology. Sharon, and then Joseph, and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I'd like to follow up on something that you just said.
Please.
That, let me find it here. For the Jews, you said.
Yes.
The Jews grasped the relation of God and man as willed and moral, covenant or compact. Yes. And so I thought about the prophet Jeremiah and his dictum to the Jews, when God said to them, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And if, and this is where the will comes in, you seek me with all your heart, I will bless you.
Yes.
Yes. And that, I think, is alluding to that verse from Jeremiah 29, verse 11.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And the other point I want to make is I am struggling with this concept because I don't think populations or epochs are homogeneous. I think there's a spectrum of it. And so I'm struggling to find where the preponderance of a thought or behavior impacts that spectrum. So when Stephen says, moderns behave one way, I kind of disagree, because I think it's a spectrum of behavior that we see.
Yeah, it's a spectrum for sure. There's a lot of diversity, but the issue is it's not an infinite diversity. That the diversity in any epoch, it's like the central tenets of the epoch are a strange attractor. So you could have all kinds of things going all kinds of directions, but there will be loops where things will come back. And certain kinds of struggles will be distinctive of an epoch. There's certain kind of arguments that are typical of one epoch and not of another, because that's how people have diversified themselves within the epoch, is over differing answers to the same questions. But it's the questions that they're wrestling with that are causing them to be tethered together, if you will. So, for example, these issues of monotheism and what are the implications, moral and epistemological and ontological, of monotheism are not characteristic of the ancient epoch, because they weren't monotheists. They're all of their premise about how do you decide right and wrong and whether you know something and what is human character like, all of that was based on a polytheistic framework. And you could get a monotheist arising during the ancient epoch, but they only arose in response to and reaction against and in the context of that polytheism. And so if you wanted to be a monotheist in the ancient epoch, you had to talk about polytheism all the time, because it was all around you and you had to react to it. And you had to react not just to the theology, but to the political structures and the rest of the culture that grew up around that set of ideas. You know, like Akhenaten, you're in opposition to a dominant culture because your idea is not dominant. You're the outlier.
So now, here's my...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So here's my other question. As we move from one epoch to the other, given that I think it's not homogeneous, it's a spectrum, what is the legacy that you take from one epoch to the other, which impacts the next epoch? Because that's where the critical point comes. And I'm sorry I can't express it in philosophical terms. It just sounds logical to me.
No, you got it right. You know, what comes through from one epoch to the next epoch isn't one simple recipe. It's always fragments of an enormous diversity of conflicts around central ideas. So we didn't just inherit the orthodoxy of medieval Christianity. We inherited the heterodoxies.
Excuse me, Sharon, could we have that Jeremiah passage you quoted again?
Jeremiah 29, verse 11.
Right.
Let's put that in the Jeremiah 29:11. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not. It's one of the ways that you know that Kenneth Smith's an existentialist and not an escapist, is he's not giving us a tidy recipe for each epoch and then saying everybody in that epoch is like that, and that's the only thing that happens when you move from one period to another. Right now, we're just reading the top level summary that he's got in this intro. And so it's not going into the depth that it's going to. But all of this is driven by the Hegelian notion of the conflicts within an epoch being the defining features that produce what we think of as the fingerprints of the epoch. Just like the tree doesn't explain itself, but is rather the results of deeper principles of life at work, having to do with the things that life has to be able to accomplish in order to survive. And a tree being one of the typical ways that it can resolve those conflicts. In the same way, when we look at an epoch like Christianity, like the medieval era, we can't look at it as though it's a thing unto itself. We have to see it as a number of things that are emerging, but they're all driven by the same underlying principles that are conflicting with each other at work. So, yeah.
I have one last thing.
Yeah, please.
So the ancients were 4 civilizations, right? Just about. You know, the Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley, and then somewhere over there in China. So that's what I'm learning from this. So when Kenneth Smith talks about the medievals, is he just talking about the Mesopotamians and how they impacted Greek culture? Or is he talking about the whole spectrum of change that came about in that time? Because medieval sounds very European to me.
Yeah,
so that's the question I have. I want to know the range in which he's talking about, because he's talking about the Jews, and those were in the region, those were in the area that was Mesopotamia.
Yeah, it's the rise of theocracy and monotheism, the intersection between the two, as a rejection of the earlier polytheism and sort of physiocratic structure of the ancient world. And so wherever that happens, it'll fit the profile of what he's talking about here. He's not trying to describe what happened in the whole world. So that's like beyond his areas of expertise, but also beyond the ability of us it happened at different times in different places. It's too hard and in different ways. So you can look at, for example, China and Japan and see an emergence of a kind of medieval era, but it's different from the European medieval era, right? Because they're not pushing back against the same specific circumstances. This is that thing that we see when we talked about the nature of life in previous months, when we said one of the things that characterizes life is not only that it is everywhere and that it is, always reproducing itself and trying to go on, but also that it is adapting itself to the things about the local circumstances that are different from other circumstances, so that in each place, it's different from every other place. The lack of uniformity, the differentiation into diversity is an essential characteristic of living systems, right? No two trees look the same, not even two apples. If you get close to them, they don't even look exactly the same.
I might mention here that we can bring in Jaspers. Jaspers comes up with the axial age, which comes with that turning point of the Greek philosophers and right across the old world. And that seems to be what Smith is defining as the ancient begins with more with Jasper's axial age, and the medieval starts later.
That might be right.
So
the punchline of what I was saying, Sharon, to bring it back to what you were asking, is what it means is that the way that the overturning of an ancient epoch into transition into a medieval epoch is going to be different in every place, because it's a living structure of culture and history. And as a living structure, it's going to adapt itself to the specific circumstances where it's emerging, which means it'll be different everywhere. It has to be different everywhere. Otherwise, it'd be a machine order instead of a living order. It's that responsiveness and sensitivity to initial conditions that makes something a living system.
Well, here is my confusion. Of all the riverbed societies or riverbed, the word physiocratic seems to be common to all of them. Because it's the way, when the hunter-gatherers settle down and they establish communal living and then cities and rural areas, physiocratic was common to all of them. Yes. And then the medieval seemed just to be European. So that's why it goes from a commonality to a singularity here. And that's where, I don't know if I'm overthinking this, but that's what I'm seeing.
This is highly relevant. So if you look at the history of Japan, you'll see that there was a long period, like in Europe and like elsewhere, there was a long period that predates the ancient era, before the rise of colonizer culture, when people are living in relatively egalitarian societies. They don't have metal yet. They have limited ability to impose warfare on each other. And they also have a limited ability to impose human design upon the environment. And so as a result, these earlier indigenous cultures are a lot more driven by nature than the cultures that follow, because they simply have to be. They just don't have the power to impose themselves on nature. And as a result, these cultures only survive if they really focus on and respect the powers of nature. They really have to identify what they are and what they demand of human beings in order for us to live in harmony. It's when human power grows great enough that we can start to dictate terms, that we see the emergence of these new forms of culture. So the ancient, what we call the ancient, is not the oldest by any means.
Okay.
In fact, all of the periods that we can identify are recent. Out of the 200, 300,000 years of human history, we don't know what happened in hardly any of it. We're only really describing the tail end. So what we see is a stage where the power of human beings grows to such a point that even though we can't impose ourselves on nature yet, we can impose ourselves on other people. And that creates the ancient epoch, ancient civilizations. Whether it's the chariot, whether it's archery, whether it's ships, whether it's bows and arrows, horses, they figure out how to dominate other peoples. And they start to build hierarchical civilizations in which they get other people to do the work for them, and then they just rule them. And this is what the Greeks, hi Ginny, are all about. And this is what, the Romans and so on are all about. Now, you can see,
well, mention the transition from the mythos culture to the logos culture.
Well, exactly. It's during the ancient epoch that we see that transition, because the ancient cultures are all emerging from these indigenous cultures that are very mythic driven, very nature driven. And they're moving towards a level of power that allows them to break free of nature to some extent. Not as much as we have, but to some extent. They can get to where they can have less respect for nature. They don't need to deify the different forces of nature.
The point is that the Egyptian transition was a very, very long one from the mythos to the logos.
That's right.
Whereas the Greeks were these
Very
primitives who suddenly received civilization from Egypt very rapidly.
Right. They moved
So
a lot.
the transition was extraordinarily rapid.
Yes. That's an important
also,
point.
you get even later on, you come to the Vikings. The transition was almost overnight.
That's right. Because as Stephen's alluding to, once somebody figures it out, other nearby cultures can go through the same transition faster than the earlier one did. They're borrowing lessons like the Greeks borrowed. So you see this in China. If you study the history of China, you can see the transition from indigenous Chinese cultures that sort of existed side by side, because not only couldn't they impose themselves on nature, they couldn't impose themselves on each other either. They just didn't have that power. You can see the transition to the stage in China where they start fighting to unify. First they start fighting to dominate, and then they start fighting to unify. It's the logical conclusion of the sequence. And a great deal of early Chinese history is centered on that question of creating one China. What they were doing there is sort of although very different, it's driven by the same kinds of ideas that are driving Rome to be the one city-state for the whole world, right? Rome's view was that they were going to improve upon the Greeks by becoming the single city-state that the whole world would be united around. Okay. So you can see the comparison. Same thing happens in Japan if you look at the history. You can see the rise of the idea of unification and the idea of militarism and conquest and so forth. So even though it's different in each place, the relationship between nature, God, and man is following an interesting parallelism in each case, because it has to do with how much power do people have over each other and over their environment.
Okay.
So in this book, he's focusing on Europe and the nearby civilizations.
Yes.
Because that's his area of expertise. But somebody else could write similar books about Africa or China or Japan, in which they took these Hegelian existentialist ideas and then used them to assess how did China go through its transitions? And when did it go through its transitions? And who were the key players? And it would read on the one hand differently, like one tree is different from another tree. But on the other hand, you'd see that they're both trees. They're both organic developments of history, that have to do with the wrestling.
Not forgetting that Lessing preceded Hegel at a simpler level.
Yes.
So what you're saying is that while he's talking about the medieval, and that's probably a European concept, there are certain fundamental elements that are common to all the riverbed societies, so to speak, as they changed, as they moved into the next area. Okay, I got it. Thanks.
You know, and before I call on other people, I really want to underscore the point you're making here, because it's so interesting. You know, when we did that yin and yang deep dive for a session, one of the things that we discovered was that the rise of Neo-Confucianism in China is similar to the rise of Christianity, in that it became a unifying religion for the entire country. And it didn't do it in the cultural exclusive way that Christianity did. It did it in a harnessing Taoism and Buddhism into a new Neo-Confucian framework, so that all three religions could be there at the same time, but they still formed a whole instead of being in opposition to each other. And that triad of Neo-Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism then allowed China to hold itself together over a very long period of time, just like medieval Christianity allowed Europe to pull itself together over a long period of time. So there's even though the fruit of it is different, you can see that same issue is at stake, that same struggle to kind of homogenize the worldview. It's interesting. It's one of the characteristics of medievalism, wherever it appears. And so when you read about the ancients in Kenneth Smith's book here, that applies more widely than Europe. But when you read about the medieval epoch, that's very Eurocentric, and it would have to be written differently for different places. But if it were, you would still see the same overall shape. And the reason for that is that the medieval epoch is what makes the modern epoch possible. It is the transitional period that pushes off from the ancient worldview to what has become a world culture for the first time. You know, there was greater diversity in the ancient and medieval epochs than there is in the modern epoch, because modernism is globalizing and spreading itself to harness the entire world into its giant world economy. And so we're doing something that's never been done before. So this is an example. This is part of why this discussion is worth having. And even though the medieval period is Eurocentric, the overall framework isn't, because we've all been captured now in the modern era. It's become the world epoch.
Wasn't there a world? Can I ask a quick question? I'm counting in line, but just a really quick question on what you just said. So the world epoch, that couldn't that be more the Christian worldview, that as much as it could be the medievals, in the sense, like, couldn't that transition have happened with Christianity?
Well, the reason that that is a big complicated discussion we'll be talking about for the next 6 months.
Okay.
But part of the reason why it's not that simple is that Christianity is not one thing in all places and all times.
Correct.
You know, there are many different Christianities calling themselves by the same name, and they're wrestling with each other for relationship to figure out how are we going to reconcile with each other, and how do we respectively want to reconcile with other worldviews. So, for example, Sharon mentioned earlier, you know, that part of what she likes in the Christianity, the way that she practices, is the ecumenical quality of it, the way that you can relate to other religions in a non-hostile way and learn from each other and learn to coexist and be kind to each other. You know, there is a version of Christianity that's based on ecumenicalism, but the medieval form specifically is not. In the medieval form, that kind of Christianity was a heresy. And even if that form that she's describing is truer to the original Christianity back in the ancient epoch when it was emerging, by the time it gets to the medieval era, it has a cultural genocide is one of its core values. It wants to exterminate all other belief. The medieval belief system wanted to exterminate all other belief systems. It wanted to be the only one.
One last point too. In the medieval period, the engagement with Christianity, more than theology, I think it was political control.
Yes.
That's the impression that I get. So therefore, a uniform, rigid doctrine is the nature of the engagement.
Yes.
Because that's how you control the population, which was largely illiterate. So that's why you have so many stained glass windows in the church, and the masses were delivered in Latin, because it was all about control. As you went from the ancients to the medievals, you had to control this growing population, and you did so by this faith.
That's right. And that's so to get back to Joseph, what Sharon said is another way of saying that I think is helpful, that, you know, that focus on homogeneity and orthodoxy only represents one branch of Christianity, but it represents the medieval branch very well. That was the medieval program, was to try to unify Europe, and if they could, the whole world, under one set of orthodoxies. Whereas Christianity includes all kinds of other versions that say, oh no, we don't want to stamp out different ideas. We want to explore different ideas in a loving way.
Correct.
So that's why I make the distinction.
Thank you very much for taking the time to answer that. I appreciate that.
Well, thanks for raising the question, because it's such an important one.
I understand it a little better now, Rick. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you, Sharon. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, first I want to say something and then something else. I mean, I think your expose about China is totally correct. I mean, in a sense, you know, first you started in a way with Lao Tzu, which comes from nature. Lao Tzu tried to enter government.
Yes.
he just gave up on it because
he
knew that kind of civilization, he wasn't jiving with it. So Confucianism was really about a kind of aristocracy, a kind of city-states. So even Confucianism was never really adopted. I mean, in early unified China, I mean, it's like it had to go through legalism and then, you know, all sorts of things before it finally arrived at Neo-Confucianism, which was already, China was already unified. That was about maintaining the unity of China, right?
Right.
And so China sort of, in a way, stopped at that point and said, you know, we got everything under control, you know, we're ahead of everybody, no need to, until the Soviets and the modern world came along. Well, actually, the moderns came before the Soviet, because Sun Yat-sen was exposed to democratic ideals. But then the Soviets, that's when they realized they were way, way behind in the development. So in some sense, they're trying to catch up. Now, whether that China will remain content with being a unified China, or whether it will, through its own way, adopt this sort of globalized view, you know, either through the expansion of land, which right now I think they're just trying to maintain it, because it's a very, very diverse culture. There's more like Russia. There are many, many different populations in different sections, and they have these what you call autonomous regions, which supposedly would be like a freer version of our American native culture. that was sort of, I suppose you could call it autonomous, but they're not really. And so they're trying to keep that under control, or whether they want to develop that, because I just saw a program on the Belt and Road Initiative was essentially an attempt to not lose the borderlands, because what happened is the division of capital has created a very, very rich coastal region. I mean, that really is equal, if not in many ways richer than many part of Europe and even Americas. And so the problem with the coastal region is that in the sense that if they lose the hinterlands, people will come in the other direction, and the coastal region would be vulnerable because it's in some ways semi-blocked at the sea. But on the other hand, it's like if the other globalized forces move through, let's say, Xinjiang and Tibet, and Manchuria and Mongolia, I mean, it would be very, very constrained. So I'm not sure whether they are building up their military in order to create an economic structure in order to maintain China, or whether that is a move to expand China through Europe, through the Middle East into Africa. I don't know. I mean, so that's a question mark to me. So in some sense, it does seem like it's a protectionist effort because they certainly want to protect the coast. But the problem is the division between the wealth and the interior is so vast that it's going to break up simply because of civil strife, right? I mean, talk about unequal distribution, like they're way, way ahead of us in terms of unequal distribution, because in some sense, it's not only people have different amounts of money and possibilities, but it's divided in regions much more so than we are in terms of the the Midwest and the coastal region between the cities and the urban and the rural areas. So in some sense, they have a big problem, and what's his name? The leader now is trying to, in a sense, clamp down on capital in order to create a more equal distribution. Now, whether that will actually work, because that's going to really piss off the rich people at the coast, right? As it collapses. So I don't know. The next question I want to ask, though, however, is the thing about, well, I actually make a transition to answer Sharon, is Hegel hated the term synthesis.
Yes.
Because synthesis was about a melting pot where everybody is the same.
Right.
He always talked about a layering which retains a separateness within the unity, right?
Yes.
So that's a very different interpretation of synthesis. They are both supposedly to roll forward and move ahead, but one retains, at least in modicum, because there will always be internal struggle and strife, this layering of multiplicity within the layering.
That's right.
Multi-layering rather than just melting it together. Because remember, America at one time, the idea of the melting pot was very, very primary, And so you have to understand that Hegel was not talking about the melting pot.
Not at all.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to ask is that it seems like the Jews understood God. Okay, fine. They had a covenant with God, but that covenant seems to me, there was a non-disclosure agreement. I'll stress it even further, right? It's a one-directional non-disclosure agreement. So you can't actually speak against God. You have to remain within that. So that's not a covenant. That's a dictatorship of non-disclosure. So they got that wrong. And the problem with that is that I end up feeling this covenant, particularly when it's transitioned into the the Christian interpretation, you begin to feel like you are just part of an experimental. You're a rat running in an experiment for God to see if it's going to work out. If the limited free will he gave to the rats will in fact find the cheese, or whether they're just running around, are they really free if they're in a lab experiment to see if they will get to the cheese, the cheese in this case, heaven, how free are they when there's actually only one circuitous path to the cheese? So I do not understand how this is a covenant when it is in fact a one-way road.
Can I just
before you jump in, Sharon, one thing to be clear about is that there's no heaven and hell in Judaism.
That's why I brought in the Christian interpretation.
The entire term Judeo-Christian is deeply misleading because it sort of implies that Judaism is more like Christianity than it really is.
But there's still the covenant, which is a non-disclosure agreement.
Well, remember that in Judaism, it's normal to argue with God.
Yes.
Which is not something you see under the medieval version of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to slip into seeing them as being more similar than they are. If the Jewish covenant with God worked the way that medieval Christians said it should have worked, then a lot of what you're saying would be right. But because Jews retained more of a sense of the importance of their own mind as engaging meaningfully with the covenant and wrestling with it and deciding for themselves and arguing with other Jews and arguing with their own rabbis and so on, it created this kind of different kind of community. And covenant is not necessarily the wrong word. I'm sure the original Hebrew word works even better than what we think of as the word covenant, that we've translated it into. But Sharon, go ahead.
Very quickly, I want to say that covenant is probably a translation from Hebrew, which means a little different in English. Because if you know the two of the big prophets in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, when God gave them instructions, they went in the mountains and said, if you're going to tell me to do that, I need to see you. Mm-hmm. Right? And and finally Elijah saw God in the wind, and Moses saw God in the burning bush, and they were in the mountains for many, many weeks or months or however they measured it until God manifested themselves to him so they could go and carry out his command. And Rick is right that the Jews have, I think, what they call chutzpah when they when they debate with God, right? And that was when Jesus came. That's why the chief scribes and elders did not favor him, because Jesus came with his own particular dictum. And when he went into the temple and saw them, he threw them out, right? Because they said, well, not only were they money changers, but they were debating the dictum from God.
Yeah, so there's the differences between the two religions are much bigger than in America we typically admit.
That's correct.
Like the term Judeo-Christian just rolls off our tongue all the time, and all my Jewish friends say they squirm whenever they hear that word. They're like, I don't think there's such a thing as Judeo-Christian.
It's two different things. I think they call those debates the mishrash. And in fact, and I am one of the books I read, which I liked before Dershowitz became Dershowitz he is today, he wrote a book called The Genesis of Justice, which was how the Jews in the Old Testament would put their case to God.
Yeah.
And he talked about Abraham when he was going to sacrifice Isaac. And there are many stories in which the Jewish people argued with their God or debated with their God on the actions they intended him to take. Genesis of Justice is a very, very good book, but Alan Dershowitz changed his nature over the years.
Yes. So Phil, one thing that you said early on in the discussion I wanted to kind of highlight briefly before I call on Stephen is the description that you gave of Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, ostensibly. His life and his philosophy have many similarities to the life and philosophy of Heraclitus, author of the Fragments. And as a couple of examples, one is they're both extremely nature-driven, physiocratic. Both philosophies are deeply immersed in what is the lawfulness of nature that we have to align ourselves with. Another is that neither could reconcile that degree of physiocracy with what they saw as the emerging governments around them. Even though they both had the potential to govern, neither of them would do it. Heraclitus stepped down from the governance that he inherited from his family, and Lao Tzu, of course, gave it a shot and then said, no, I don't think this is for me. And both of them retreated. Lao Tzu leaving China and being forced to write the book at the gates before the guard would let him go, and Heraclitus retreating to the mountains writing a scroll, depositing it at the Temple of Artemis, then going back to the mountains. In both cases, they were what Stephen identified as the transition from mythos culture to logos culture. They both captured a deeper level of the mythos culture, and they both found that it was incompatible with the course of the ancient epoch was shifting towards a logos culture, and they found their philosophies were incompatible with the new cultures, and so they had to distance themselves. And so in that, we sort of see that Hegelian dialectic at work in the definition of that epoch, both in China and in Greece. Despite the fact that they're so far apart and so different in so many ways that matter, there is this underlying transition that's going on that is making some things that used to be not only possible, but the dominant way of seeing things, are making them harder and harder to coexist with the new powers that are emerging, the new laws and norms that are emerging.
The Chinese did retain that. I mean, the scholars are always like contemplating nature, but it's reduced to the weekends. Like I said, in the weekdays, yes, you work for Confucius, and the weekends you could go and contemplate Lao Tzu.
Exactly.
So they retain that.
It's like the medieval program couldn't figure out how to reconcile itself with these older fragments, and so it suppressed them in Europe. But the medieval program in China came up with a solution that allowed it to find a place for these other fragments that you would have thought would be in opposition to it, and make them work together. The other critical thing, I think, of course, that's so fascinating about the difference between the medieval era in Europe and the medieval era in China is that China's medieval era begins with unification and stays unified, with ups and downs and struggles along the way, but basically stays unified through the whole medieval epoch. It's not like unification was a dream that they wondered if they would ever achieve it. It was something they had at the beginning, and whenever they lost it, they went back to it. It was the norm. Whereas in Europe, they only dreamed of unity. They never had it. Even to the end of the medieval epoch, they never achieved it. But they also never stopped dreaming of the new Holy Roman Empire they wanted to make, to become that was the premise of the medieval church. We will unite all of us under one culture, one government under God. But they were never able to do it. But it was what they couldn't stop thinking about. And so you sort of see how when to talk about Sharon's point about the diversity in different places, that the differences are more than just whether you're, medieval Christian versus medieval Neo-Confucian. It can be as different as, do you begin having achieved the dream of your epoch and you're just struggling to hang on to it, you're struggling for stability? Or does it begin with, you've never achieved it, you want it, and by the end of your epoch, you still don't have it, but you still can't stop dreaming about it. But it's the same struggle that they just endlessly talk about and are endlessly writing about from their two different perspectives. It's how it's reasonable to say that there is a medieval epoch in both places, despite the fact that it takes such a different shape, is that they're struggling with the same questions and wrestling with them. Stephen, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, the thing with Christian Europe, we talk about the Great Wall of China, and we talk about the Chinese as if they've sealed themselves off from other cultures, and Japan and China have done that in periods, and they neglect the fact that Europe did the same thing during the medieval. The Christians sealed the Christian faithful off from the rest of the world. Yes. I mean, to some degree, in the old world, that Europe, the European culture, succumbed to a longer dark ages and went down to a greater depths of dark ages, and other cultures did. But
it's a good point.
But we also have the trend in scholasticism. This went somewhere. This did evolve. This did create a basis. Whether there was scholasticism in other cultures, it doesn't seem to have gotten anywhere, or it was overshadowed. But if we were to look at the world in the 11th century, and I'm floating up in space, maybe I'm with Jeffrey and God out of the cartoons, floating and saying, look at the old world. The Greeks were very bright, but the whole trip has sunk. We're looking at the world in the 11th century. And you say, well, which is going to become the dominant culture in 1,000 years? And you look at the Chinese, very impressive. The Sung dynasty was very inventive.
Right.
Or you look at the Indian culture, they're chasing the heights. By the later medieval period, the Indian culture will be the most advanced in mathematics and some sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Or even you're looking at the Muslim culture, it straddles the world. It as yet hasn't suffered the shock of the Mongols who come down and burn down the centre of its culture a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're looking in the 11th century and you say, well, look at this culture here that straddles the English Channel. You got France, England, Britain, the Low Countries, Germany. Their major export is mud. Their name is mud. And then God says to Jeffrey that this culture will dominate the world in 1,000 years. And you go, you've got to be joking.
You've got to be kidding. How could it be?
But there is a warning in the 11th century.
Yeah.
And there is something which occurs, not just the Crusades, but there's a particular crusade that gives you the warning about these people who are named mud.
Mm-hmm.
And well, we see the crusade where all the nobles go off. It's not so unusual to conquer some distant part of the world.
Right.
We've seen that in other places. We've seen that with the Mongols. We've seen that with the Arabs. We've seen that with maybe even the Chinese at times. But you've got the crusade of Peter the Hermit when he drags up a whole load of commoners to go off and invade some part of the world. Commoners don't do that in other places, really. I mean, certainly the Chinese commoners have revolted again and again to overthrow the emperor and put in his place an emperor who proves just as lunatic as the previous ones. But this look at the 11th century, look at this culture which is named mud, which is rejecting the rest of the world, which has got, is bound by this Christian church, which is becoming more and more powerful in the West, rejecting every other culture. It's built the great wall of Christendom and we won't allow anything else in.
Mm-hmm. And
yet it's put within 1,000 years, within less than 1,000 years, it's put man on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's something there that you're going to have to find that isn't in the other cultures. This Occidental culture has twice come up with first it comes up with the Greeks, which has something which arises in a spectacular fashion. The Persian Empire threatens the Greeks. After a couple of centuries, these little Greeks conquer the Persian Empire.
Which no one would have imagined. No one would have imagined that would be the outcome. Because Persia was huge.
The 11th century with the people of the mud, which land on the moon.
Right.
The cultures that worship the moon, they say, oh, look, Neil Armstrong stood on that. Do you worship Neil Armstrong? Okay.
Yeah, no, there's an enormous amount in what you said that's going to be, recurring themes over the next few months as we work our way through this book, because those are questions that have to be answered. How is it even remotely possible that the petty squabbling Greeks overthrew glorious Persia? Yeah. I mean, in hindsight, when we tell this story, we always tell it the wrong way. We say the amazing, glorious Greeks defeated the effete, corrupt Persians who were just, They were just begging to collapse. And in so doing, in our attempt to valorize our heroes, we actually do them an injustice, because it erases what an astonishing achievement it was. Because Persia was everything, and the Greeks were a backwater. And how on earth did these squabbling city-states pull themselves together enough to do that? It's unthinkable. And it's so unthinkable that later the Greeks and the Romans would write about it. There's one of the favorite quotes that Kenneth Smith has is from a historian, a late Alexandrian historian, quoting an earlier historian who's talking about who would have imagined that this backwater Greeks would conquer Persia, and their name would, the name of the Alexandrians would spread across the world. And who then, in the next generations to come, would have imagined that the Alexandrians, who were the rulers of everything, were about to be overthrown by the Romans, who were just a squabbling bunch of backwater people. It's like they say in this, the thing about history is that it's not predictable in advance. It's not clean. It's not tidy. It doesn't drop into clean little definitions and sections. It is full of these astonishing surprises. And any attempt to explain history has to be able to explain, how can history do that? So that these nobodies become everybody, and who was previously everybody becomes nobody. How is that even possible? So it's among the things we're going to be wrestling with in the things to come. I also am glad you brought up Islam, because Islam is an example of, if you set it side by side with Christianity, it makes another really interesting comparison about the relationship between the ancient world and the medieval world. There's no question that Islam had a medieval era. One could argue that Islam never had an ancient epoch, that the ancient epoch was the polytheism that preceded it that we don't know much about today, because it's almost entirely been erased. But that the age of the rise of Islam was, in an even more dramatic fashion than the rise of Christianity. The rise of Islam was a line in the sand that said before this was another religion and another culture, and we didn't exist at all. We weren't there, and we just decided to do this. We decided to overthrow polytheism and to create unity. And to create a theocratic state. And they then proceeded to do so. And the entire history of the religion from there forward up until the modern era was them. It was, cleaner than we see anywhere else in the world. It was a nice, well-defined medieval era. And they then spread that idea of unity, all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from Indonesia to Morocco, this huge band of unity. It's an astonishing accomplishment, and again, in a different way to Christianity, in a different way than medieval Christianity, in a different way from medieval Neo-Confucianism, the rise of medieval Islam was nevertheless about some of the same underlying issues. It was clearly a revolt against polytheism. It was clearly driven by, trying to accomplish some of the same things for their own different reasons, in their own different way, in their own different place. So to go back to Sharon's earlier point, once again, what we see is the way in which the actual working out of history doesn't look like a noetic logical syllogism at all. It looks like a gnostic living organism that is unfolding according to the same core principles, but in different ways, in different places, because in order to be alive, it has to be aware of and sensitive to its conditions and adapt to them beautifully. This is that Hegelian bud, blossom, and fruit that he applies to history. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I'm not a student of history. So to understand this philosophy, I'm trying to catch up on world history. And one of the things I'm impressed with is the revisionism that goes on and the debates about certain facts, which really impacts the way we see it.
It's relentless.
Yes. But one of the things that I am seeing is that as these epochs change, you go from the ancients to the medievals to the moderns, these land masses, so to speak, are subject to expansion and relocation as from invasions, whether by wars or by nomadic tribes. And if they hit I hate to say the civilization at a vulnerable period, then it changes.
Yes.
Am I correct about that? That's my, and then the other question I have is, what is considered the classical period? Because that term was confusing me. Is that the time of the medieval period also? No. What is that? How do I put that in the framework that I am trying to understand?
So it's different in different places, but if we apply it to the Greeks, classical Greece is the era in Greece that comes well into the transition to a logos culture, but before the Alexandrian Hellenistic period. So things haven't been united yet, right? We haven't seen Alexander the Great. We haven't built the great libraries. We haven't done any of that stuff yet. But the ideas that lead to that, and the political and military and economic organizations that are going to make that possible are already present in the world. And they're aware of themselves, and they're talking about themselves, and they see what they are, and they see what their potential is. It's part of what's so interesting about the classical Greek era is that, as Stephen says, they sort of rapidly raced from a mythos culture to a logos culture. But the whole time they knew they were doing it, and they wrote about it because they saw it was an unusual thing. They wrote about it while they did it. And of course they sensed their own end, which is something that most civilizations don't do. And they wrote about that too, they worried about how it was all going to come out. But generally speaking, the classical Greek era is usually considered to be from the establishment of the Athenian constitution until, I'd say, probably most people would put it at the conquest of Greece by Alexander the Great, or by his father, Philip of Macedon. But honestly, those last few years, it's hard to say. They were already falling apart and, bound up in endless civil war. So most people really mean a much narrower period, right around Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. Can
you give me a time period, like 1100, 800 BC? What time is the classical period?
Call it Periclean Athens. Athens under the realm of Pericles. He would have died in about 429 or something. It's primarily 5th century.
Oh, 5th century. Okay.
So that's the 400s BCE is the 5th century.
Yeah.
Yes, I got that.
They rose with the attacks by the Persians in 590, 580. And then by the end in 404, they're lost to Sparta and the Peloponnesian War. Kind of the end of the flourishing.
Yeah. From the Persian War to the Peloponnesian War is a pretty good set of bookmarks. Okay. There were important things before that made it possible. There are important things after that were the continuations and the developments, but that's usually what's meant. And the thing is, those dates only apply to that. So if you're talking about classical China, it's a whole different set of dates. And the same with any other period that you choose to look at. The classical doesn't have a unified global term.
Okay.
Well,
I'll study some more.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you get history that really digs into how and why things are happening, it starts to stick. Whenever history is just a recitation of dates and names, there's nothing to hang on to. It's just facts.
Well, this medium is very invigorating, what we're doing now. because to read history would probably be boring, but reading it in this context is extremely fascinating for me.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Phil, go ahead.
Well, classical in China would be the original Confucian analects. That would be it. Not the Neo-Confucianism, but that would be the classical period.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get to the idea of mythos and
Please.
revisionism.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And I want to get to it in relationship with the lost cause, which scares me.
Oh God.
Because that's happening. The Romans were very clever in creating the myth of Aeneas,
Yeah.
which, by the way, looks a hell of a lot like Odysseus traveling around.
Not surprising.
Aeneas was the son of he was one of the people that escaped Troy when it was destroyed.
Right.
And he sailed around and around and then finally reached Rome and founded Rome, right? And so that was the myth of Rome conquering Greece and transforming Greece, a reinterpretation of the Greek culture into the Roman culture.
Right.
And so in a sense, it was a kind of revisionist history that in a sense through storytelling, because and about the lost cause. Because Rome was the new Troy,
right?
Who was defeated, who lost, but it sustained itself through Rome, and then eventually rose power to defeat. Now, here the reason why I find that a little funny is in the sense, in the Civil War, we had the lost cause.
Yes. And
the transformation of the lost cause now, to me, in a sense, is manifested in January 6th. We have to be very, very careful about the underlying myth, right? So therefore, in a sense, yes, they fought and they lost and they never gave up. And now they're coming back. And January 6th is the manifestation of the lost cause in a funny way, but a transformation because it's spread out in a much broader culture than the originally defeated South. I just want to point out that even those people who don't believe in the myth sustains itself in certain ways in the storytelling through revisionism. If you can revive the myth, then the lost cause becomes an underlying structure to help you explain, in a sense, how it's manifested in the world. So just be careful of myth in one sense, because it can do good, but it can also do bad. And be careful of revisionism, particularly tied up with the lost cause and myth. So I just wanted to say that, just to clarify that there is danger in storytelling as well as good in storytelling.
Yeah. And it's part of what we are as an animal, that we have to tell stories, as we're the unfinished animal, and we need culture to finish us. And different cultures put different levels of emphasis on how much of that finishing is provided by the culture and how much does the individual need to take over the work and finish themselves.
Can I just say something? Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Are you allowing me to interrupt?
Please.
Because I just want to follow up with something what Phil said about the lost cause. Because I'm a foreign national from another place. And so the verdict last week with Ahmaud Arbery really caught my attention. Yeah. And this is when Phil is talking about the lost cause, because here it is in the Deep South, and I live in the Deep South, right? We have 11 white people convicting a man for carrying out what they thought was legitimate under 1836 law, right? And is that the culture changing? And I mean, I've listened to a couple of pundits debate it, or was that just a one-off? So when Phil talks about the lost cause, it's still evolving.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the
Remember,
best I can say about it.
But remember, there was the other guy that was acquitted in Wisconsin. So the struggle is still continuing.
Right.
But you know, Phil, as a minority, I can tell you that was a turning point, because one of my friends called me and said, well, Kyle Rittenhouse got off. And ashamedly, my reflex was, well, how many Black people did he kill? And she said none. And then my angst came down. And that is very bad. And that is a culture. And in fact, I kind of got a little embarrassed and ashamed of myself, because those were human beings that were dead.
That's right. That's
you
right.
know, and that is not supposed to be the reaction, but this is the culture in which we live. And so my genuflecting allowed me to do that. So sorry, Rick, we're digressing here, but he brought up the lost cause, and that's an evolutionary process in my eyes.
Yeah, the general problem is that when we're immersed in an epoch, we're the least suited to critique it or to understand where we are in that epoch. Because as Stephen alluded to earlier, the course of history is full of these just shocking reversals and surprises. It makes it very hard to see in advance or at the moment where things are going. And yet something in us is desperate to know where we're going and where we are. We want to be grounded. So we have this irreconcilable angst. We have this, and we resolve it by filling in with stories. We tell ourselves stories about how we got where we are and where we're going based on that. But the stories are rarely based on what actually happened. They're usually based on our need right now to feel like we have some control or at least understanding of the course of our times. Part of what's interesting about this approach to the philosophy of history is that it spends a lot less time sort of rolling around in the usual arguments between political parties today, almost all of which are benighted discussions because they don't have the context, and focuses more on, well, what about the history that we can look back on? It's far enough away we can look back on it and see, how did it happen? Why did it happen the way it did? And then try to trace it forward enough, maybe not to be able to explain the details of this trial or that trial, because that's too immersed, too swimming in the waters to be able to detect the water. But at least maybe then we can find kind of what's the big shape of the picture that we're in. Maybe we can find some details of the frame and the edges of the puzzle that can then help us make better guesses about what might be happening. Because without that, it's almost impossible. There's just, even if we weren't ignorant, we are perversely incentivized. We are highly motivated to need certain kinds of answers. And so we will find those answers whether they're there or not. It makes it just too hard to figure out what's going on. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, bringing up the question of Aeneas, or bringing up the question of Homer. I find it intriguing. Homer's writing for the Greeks.
Yes.
Basically.
Yes.
So he tells the story of Troy, who is the one fine, upstanding example of humanity in the Iliad.
Hector.
Yeah. And is Hector a Greek?
No.
In other words, Homer's telling the Greeks, the finest example of humanity I can find is on the other side. Achilles. You Greeks are bringing up Achilles. Yeah, he's a great warrior. He's an arrogant braggart who, in the story, dies ignobly. I mean, Hector dies nobly at the hands of Achilles. And what happens to Achilles in the end? He dies in a street fight with an arrow stuck in his heel.
Right.
And I don't know. Has anybody brought up this point that he's holding up Hector as the example of the good man, the man who rises above selfish motives, to serve his society as best he can. And then he compares him with Achilles. Achilles is a heel.
He's a heel.
He's a prick.
He's
saying to the Greeks, your best is this prick. Achilles, look what the other guy's got. You know, the other side's got Hector. He's the worthy man. He's the man to emulate.
Yes.
Wait, let's not go too far. Hector was also protecting Paris, who started the whole thing as well. So let's not go too far. Let's not go too far in that analogy.
But Phil, he had to, under the culture of the time, he had a duty to care for his family. And he had a duty to care for his city. If the Greeks had come there and asked for something reasonable in terms of punishment for Paris, Hector probably would have gone with it. But because they came so inflamed and enraged, asking for too much, Hector was bound by the ethics of his day to defend the city.
Yeah, but that was Agamemnon.
Agamemnon.
Achilles.
It's part of what's so painful about reading the struggles between Agamemnon and Achilles is it's like neither of them is a worthy person. They're both awful. So I put in the chat one of the books that Kenneth Smith recommends is by James Redfield, and it's called Nature and Culture in the Iliad: The Tragedy of Hector. And he argues that Hector is the protagonist. That's the point. What Stephen is saying is dead on right, and that it was the intention, because the purpose of the Iliad was to teach the Greeks how to be better than the people who had screwed everything up there beforehand. Their noble, heroic ancestors had really blown things, and they wanted to make sure every Greek who grew up got that story drilled into their bones so that they wouldn't do the same thing all over again. And that's why Hector has to be the hero. He has to be the most noble person there, so that we can see how tragic it is that these, more brutal people persevered and dished out so much damage and caused such chaos.
But how come the Greeks didn't understand the tragedy and they thought it was a heroic thing? I mean, to me, it's really shameful.
Yeah, it is, and they knew. They weren't, their national epic was not a national epic of glorious victory the way an American epic would be. It was an epic of shameful tragedy. It's like the best of us did this terrible thing and caused the collapse of civilization that we're now struggling to raise ourselves out of. If they hadn't screwed everything up,
we've got Arjuna and Krishna as well.
Say that again?
Arjuna, who had the problem that he had the choice between two bad state of affairs.
Yeah.
He had to choose between one evil or the other.
Yes. Yeah, there's a line in Heraclitus where he says, people are always choosing the wrong things. They don't understand that if you only had to choose one thing, you should choose wisdom, because wisdom stands apart from all else. And no matter what virtue you think you're pursuing, if you do it without wisdom, it's going to turn into a vice. It's just too dangerous. And it was literally only this second that it occurred to me that that's a reference to the judgment of Paris. Which goddess do you want the rewards from? And of course, he chooses the sexy goddess instead of the wise goddess. And disaster follows for the entire Mediterranean. It's like, you have to be careful messing with these forces, man. They are bigger than you are. So, but I just finished, a week ago, I just finished reading The Rise of the Greek Epic by Gilbert Murray. And last week, I put a link to where on the Internet Archive you could download your copy of it. And in it, he makes some very interesting arguments based on text analysis. Modern text analysis is allowing people to figure out where interpolations have been put into ancient works, where people have been editing work, where later people have edited earlier works in order to change the story, change the dialogue, change the action. But in so doing, they do so using later idioms that hadn't been invented yet. And so you can see the fingerprints of their edits on the resulting manuscripts. And so he's writing this this book, The Rise of the Greek Epic, from the perspective of these 19th and 20th century text editors and analysts who are studying the fingerprints of the people who had been tampering with the Iliad and the Odyssey to figure out, well, who was doing what, who was changing it to say what, and when did they make those changes and why. And it's very interesting. One of his core arguments is that the Iliad, even more than the Odyssey, but the Iliad especially, was still being heavily edited during the time of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And it really didn't settle down into its final form until the Alexandrian period, when they were working on textual analysis. And he's drawing on basically the entire history of scholarship. He cites so many other scholars and what they have to say on the matter. So you can see, why would the Greeks in their war against the Persians, why they might like a national epic that shows the Greeks putting aside their battles and all coming together to fight a common enemy, right? It played a role in the propaganda that led to uniting against the Persians. And then later, in trying to prevent civil war, editing it further to show why these squabbles between the city-states, shouldn't be allowed to get out of hand, or else catastrophe will follow. At exactly the time when the Peloponnesian War is heating up, they're editing it, going, when the Greeks start fighting amongst themselves, terrible things come out of it. They weren't able to head it off, but it seems clear that they tried, and that you can see them trying it in that document.
Rick, I'm just amazed, Rick. What kind of a person would be interested to read that kind of information? I'm just always just so amazed at the kind of information that it's just amazing. I mean, what made you interested in reading something like that? I'm just always so flabbergasted by what you know. It's amazing.
To be fair, it's one of my favorite areas. I mean, I have some childhood interests that have stuck with me all my life. I love dinosaurs and evolution. I love the Greek myths. I have a list of Native America. I have a list of things like this. And so it's not really a question of being rational or being, a grown-up, or being, a professor or anything like that. It's me indulging my childhood interests and continuing to play with them. So,
but this interest developed on your own without your parents encouraging or nurturing, or
they gave me books when I was little, and I read them and reread them and reread them, and yeah, sure. But so it's part of why, for me, reading a textual analysis of the Iliad is interesting, because I've been reading the Iliad my whole life, so I know it really well. It's like if people who are into Star Trek, and I was as a kid, if people who are into Star Trek, read a book that talks about the behind the scenes making of Star Trek and what were the arguments going on, and why did Uhura get so few lines, and so on. It's a sort of a natural nerdy kind of thing to do, that whatever your interests are, you go a little further and start reading meta stuff about how it came to be.
I might point out here that in the Snary's Edda, the Norse gods are Trojan princes who escaped Troy.
Right? Yes, the story of Troy.
I'm working on. I want a Trojan prince in my ancestry as well. I'll paint him in somewhere.
Yes. Well, in Rise of the Greek Epic, Gilbert Murray talks about what you're talking about, Stephen. Why did the Romans pick up the story of Aeneas and tell that as where they came from? And he says there came a time in the development of Rome when they were moving from a republic to an empire, where the old story of Romulus and Remus just didn't cut it anymore. It wasn't noble enough. It wasn't a deep enough history. And this, they did exactly what you're saying they did. They said, what would be noble? We should trace our ancestry all the way back to the Trojan War, because that's the great epic. And furthermore, let's pick the coolest guys in it. And we've decided they'll be the Trojans. And, Aeneas was already there in the Iliad waiting to be borrowed for this purpose.
Well, but it's interesting to note that Homer told the story after the Bronze Age collapse. So I mean, in order to understand the fall of civilization at that time, we have to understand it wrapped in the Bronze Age collapse, because it really did really fall into a dark ages for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So like, I think that tragedy almost in a sense, I wouldn't quite say hold it responsible as part of the trigger for the Bronze Age collapse, because the what is the original Greeks, the Mycenaeans, were partly responsible for that sort of stuff. I mean, not totally, but partly responsible for, in a sense, you know, all that warfare. And so there was other factors, obviously the sea people and all sorts of rivalries between the states, but nonetheless, it was an important epoch that I think we do not understand. It would be maybe roughly, and even more than World War II or World War I put together, because it really affected culture for hundreds of years.
It was a world war from their perspective. Yeah, the world they knew completely fell apart afterwards. And you know, there are a lot of theories about who the sea peoples were that ran around trashing all the civilizations of the Mediterranean during the Dark Age. But one of the theories is that it was the Mycenaeans themselves. Because, you know, when we look at the older strata of the Iliad, we see that the ancient heroic ethos was based around being a conqueror. In fact, not a conqueror who then ruled, but the term they used was sacker of cities.
Oh.
You wanted to be able to say, I destroyed Troy. I'm the one who took down Tyre or Sidon. I'm, you know, glorious so-and-so who destroyed. And the problem is, if you take that to its logical conclusion, it leads to the sacking of all the cities. There is something about the sort of course of activities of the sea peoples in trashing all the Mediterranean civilizations that lines up really 100% with the Mycenaean ethos. It doesn't prove they did it, but it proves they had motive. And not only did they have the motive, it was their core motive they were the most proud of anything. So first there's that. The other really interesting thing to come out of this book by Gilbert Murray is the idea that this threw me for a loop. There may not have been a Trojan War. The Greeks may not have sacked Troy. None of that may have happened. And one of the arguments in favor of that is that the Iliad is a composite of poetic works drawn from multiple sources, and we know what some of those sources were. So enormous passages of the Iliad were repurposed from an older epic called the Thebaid, about the seven against Thebes, which comes after the story of Oedipus. The story about how the seven went against Thebes and eventually sacked it. Enormous passages of that poetry were lifted wholesale and put into the Iliad, and then the names were changed and the locations were changed. And one of the things that he says in Rise of the Greek Epic is, if you go through the Iliad and you take out this chunk from the Thebaid and this chunk from Argonautica, this chunk from the, you know, Heracles, you have almost nothing left. And that it may be that they needed a national epic to unite against the Persians, and so they created it out of their previous epics. He says, for sure, we can see that Troy collapsed over and over, you know, at least 7 stages of collapse and the different levels of ruins. So there's no question about that. He says, but it may not have had anything to do with a Greek expedition, right? It might even have been, you know, a civil war internally, or it might be that everybody hated Troy because it was, you know, strangling the trade that passed through the narrows right outside of it. It might be that at some time or another, everybody sacked Troy. That's just part of what you did. First, Troy would squeeze you and squeeze you and squeeze you, and you'd be giving up all these tariffs and in trade goods, and then you'd sack Troy, you know, and then everybody would be like, yay, free trade again. He says, you know, it's hard to say now because there's so little of the Iliad that we can definitively prove was originally about Troy at all. And I got to say, it's the first time I've ever run into that theory. He says, oh yeah, there was a Troy and there were Mycenaeans and all these things were here, but they've all been put together into an original form for the purposes of poetry and politics. I don't know, you know, that was early 20th century. I don't know how far the scholarship has come since then, but it's certainly a really interesting hypothesis. Sharon, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Can we come back to the text?
Please.
I want to follow up on something that Stephen said in his opening remarks.
Yeah.
When he talked about animals, because was Stephen or was it Donald? I don't remember.
Donald was the first one with the opening remarks.
Well, then I guess Stephen's personal open remarks when he talked about, did he talk about animals where he said? Because
the nature of their minds, I said animals were heavily scripted compared to humans, which are loose in the head.
Okay, so it was Donald. Because there's a part in the text here that I wondered if we could talk about as we kind of wrap up. It says animals do not deliberate values or policies.
Right.
Do not format or discipline themselves. They adapt and gravitate to a habitat.
Yes.
Or negotiate conflicts between instincts and environment.
Yes.
Animals frame no true language or laws, create no true societies or polities, because they have severely limited powers to reason or originate on their own order. And then he makes the transition. He says, this is what man's modicum of spirit means.
Yes.
That he is architected to take responsibility in some measure for the terms of his existence.
Right.
And that goes back to my Jeremiah passage, but I just wanted us to discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a central premise of this, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's core to this. And this is one of the places where my take is compatible with, but a little different from Kenneth's, because my argument is not as simple as saying this is something that we can do that's better than the animals. My take is that we are missing something that other animals have, and so we have to do this. They have that rich suite of instincts that guides them to want the things that are good for them. And if they didn't have that, their species would have died out. But what we did in our evolution was evacuate a whole bunch of those instincts and create a craving for culture. And thus, we could be dramatically different from each other, going back to Stephen's argument about the cannons rolling about on the ship. It's like, is it going to work for our advantage, or is it going to pop out the other side and sink us? This is the huge variability of Homo sapiens comes from the evacuation of all those instincts, which gives us a drive for culture. And this is where I'm compatible with Kenneth Smith's line on this. I'm just coming at it from an evolutionary take instead of a strictly Hegelian take, which is like Kenneth. I'd say we need culture in a way that animals don't. It's not that none of them have culture, but they don't need it for the reasons that we need it. And the same is true for reason. They have, you could look at the cortex and the structure of the brain of mammals and birds and fish, and you see they have hemispheres. They just don't need them as badly, and the prefrontal cortex in particular isn't as developed in them as it is in us. And it has to be in us because we are lacking that bonus of instincts to keep us inside a safe frame. We need a culture to do it for us. And so what it is that we choose, what it is that we will, to put it in a medieval or modern perspective, or to put it in a ancient perspective, what it is that we can cultivate ourselves to become capable of, or what it is that we can be cultivated by our culture to be capable of. These things are incredibly important to Homo sapiens, because without them, we wouldn't make it. And it's not an accident that Homo sapiens both has a drive for culture and has a big hole where a bunch of our instincts ought to be. The two of them were evolved to work together. It's that hunger that kind of creates these drives that they're talking about. So when he talks about spirit here, this is part of what he's going to explore in this is the way that to the ancients, the purpose of human spirit was to help us rise above the basal metabolism of the mind, right? Mm-hmm. To go beyond the possibilities of a doulos or a benausos, to go beyond the possibilities of, to use Hegel's terms, Begriff and Verstand, to cultivate that, and I'm going to use the term that Phil rightly points out that Hegel despised, to cultivate that synthesis of the two, or rather the fruit of the two, the higher stage of development that an adult human being should be capable of. And that's what Kenneth equates with spirit, that higher level ability in which we harness both gnosis and noesis to be able to deal with the world experientially and rationally at the same time, by harnessing both of those faculties to the evidence of the world and what it has to teach us about how it really works. And what's fascinating is that just like the medieval revolution redefined spirit so that just like it redefined the gods, just like it redefined character, just like it redefined nature, just like it redefined free will and everything else to be set up on the theocratic framework of medievalism, so too it redefined spirit to be redefined within the framework of medieval theocracy. So spirit is no longer that adult faculty that we're trying to cultivate to do better than the worst of us do. It now becomes this imago Dei, this image of the capacity of God to will the universe into existence, but at a finite scale, that we can will a little bit into existence, and that what we want to use it for is to will ourselves into alignment with God so that we can experience salvation, right? This is an enormous transformation of what it means to have spirit or to be a spiritual being. It's, in some ways, you can trace it through and see how this is a development out of the earlier era, but in other ways, you can at the same time see how radically incompatible it is with the old ideas. The old idea was that by aligning ourselves with nature and cultivating our character, we could learn to do things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. We could become better. We could, if enough people did that and we worked together, we could save ourselves here on Earth and make a better world and a better society. But the medieval argument is no, you had your chance and instead you made Rome. And Rome was a disaster. It was corrupt. So we don't believe you anymore. We don't think that you can cultivate yourselves to be good enough. And so what we want you to do is put yourselves in the hands of God and do whatever God tells you, because he is the only thing that's pure and good and perfect. And everything else is hopeless. And furthermore, if you try to make anything better yourself, that's just ego, and you deserve to burn in hell for that. Because, we don't want to go back to the corruption of late Rome. And your path of trying to become a better person will inexorably lead to the corruption of Rome. So there's this way in which the concept of spirit has become part of this whole critique of history and this whole rejection of the ancient worldview, as well as playing this critical part in salvation theology for saying, what's the relationship between man and God and eternity? I'm glad you quoted that passage because it's so critical. Phil, and then Joseph, and Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think the problem there lies in the fact that culture, or maybe you could say the human spirit in a way, produces derivatives, which essentially creates an inflation. And I mean, in this case, inflation, presumably in a good way.
Sure.
The inflation of possibilities. That inflation of possibility creates as a surplus, which creates its own feedback loop.
Yes.
And that feedback loop is incredibly alluring because it actually shows itself not only in terms of ideas, but in terms of things in the world, which the lion, no matter how powerful he is by his instincts, does not create a surplus, but maintains the stasis that it was.
That's right.
And I think that alluring nature, in a sense, creates now ever more this sort of division that separates the static nature or I would say the stasis that sustains itself. I would say sustainability. Maybe I shouldn't call it stasis, because nature does evolve. The sustainability versus the surplus. I mean, if you just say it those words, do you want sustainability or you want surplus added?
Right.
And I think that feedback loop has, in some ways, displays, overshadow, put in the distance or connection to the state sustainability until, of course, a surplus finally gets to a point where it shows, like I said, in the supply chain, that there's some problems in not only the supply chains and the manifestation of the surplus, but also a problem in the delivery of ideas as well.
Yeah.
So I think we are now beginning to, in a sense, come to the point that maybe we have gone out of balance between the surplus culture and sustainability of nature. And I think maybe it's too late, but at least we're beginning to realize that, and it's fortunate that we did not lose that layering in the meantime altogether, right? So that we could see, maybe sustainability is an important part of the surplus
Right.
as well. So I think we are really caught at that point. It's most demonstrated in a sense in the economy, because it affects us every day, right? If we don't have the surplus, you go to the store and there's no toilet paper or whatever it is, and you say, oh, wait a minute, this surplus is not a surplus after all. And then I guess that you create another thing. You buy a closet full of toilet paper.
Right.
Just in case. So you have some sustainability. So I think that is a problem we're running into. And for a long time, we have ran ahead of the problem to a certain degree. And now I'm not sure whether we can. And I think we're beginning to realize that. So that's why I want to say that inflation and surplus is not necessarily a wrong thing. It's a alluring thing that has distracted us from sustainability.
This traces back to the earliest stages of Christianity after Jesus, when everybody thought any day now it was all going to be over. You can see some of this in some of Paul's authentic letters, where he talks about the apocalyptic notion that by the time people died, the second coming would have happened. That are, the end of this era and the beginning of eternity would happen while people were still alive who witnessed Jesus's ministry. And Paul ferociously argues, saying, there's limits to how much you should be piling up for the future, because there's no point. History had its beginning point. It had its major inflection point in the ministry of Jesus, and the end point is now, or tomorrow, or next week, or next year. But anyway, now. So don't waste your time worrying about the future. That's pointless. It's all going to come to an end. And you can see in the forgeries that came later, when people put things under Paul's name that he didn't write, which we can tell now, which were Paul and which were not. And also with the Gospels, which came later, you can see where the church is beginning to go, okay, well, at this point, everybody who was alive who witnessed Jesus is dead. So we need to stop talking about that part. And we need to instead start talking about a church that needs to go on, that needs to, survive into the future. And we need to be thinking about sustainability in a way that we didn't during Paul's lifetime. You can literally read in the Gospels and in the
book of Revelation.
Yeah, you can read the transition from it's going to end any day now to we need to be here for the long haul. And so there's always been this tension within Christianity from the very beginning between, well, which religion is it? Is it the one that comes to an end, presumably soon, because the whole world ends? Or is it the one that needs to survive for the long haul and take care of everybody? And by putting Revelations at the end of the book, they sort of, the builders of the canon, unfortunately, sort of create the impression that the important thing is that it's going to come to an end. And that's what you see with the modern movement towards, any day now it'll all be over. But there are earlier books in the New Testament that make clear that the church recognized that, actually we need to stop, throwing away all of our savings, and we need to start thinking about how to take care of our kids and their kids, and how to make an ongoing thing here. That struggle between it, is there any point in planning for the future, carries forward into the modern epoch. Some of the don't worry about the future because it's all going to end got transformed without God. When God is overthrown in the modern era, it transforms into don't worry about the future because the only thing that matters is winning. Only pragmatism matters. We don't have time for highfalutin sustainability, eco crap. None of that matters. What matters is, can you pay your employees next week? And are our investors going to get a return on investment next quarter? And if you can't say yes to that, then you're out and we'll bring in somebody who can. So there is this kind of cutting away of all other considerations in order to create a focus on the present that in some ways mirrors the apocalyptic vision of that particular branch of medieval Christianity, that there's no point in the future, so why think about it? It's just futile. And you sort of, even though it's gone through an alchemy and transformed into different justifications, it still ends up with the same result. It's a medievalism that's buried now deep into the philosophy of our modernist economies. Joseph and then Stephen. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I just have a very brief question, because this could help with clarifying a couple of different things about Nietzsche.
Sure. Nietzsche.
So the same idea of spirit that you just described, that Kenneth Smith's talking about, and our need for culture.
Yeah.
Is it pretty much the same thing? Is that what Nietzsche is getting at? What Nietzsche was getting at with the need for art and things along those lines? Okay, it's the same concept fundamentally.
Closely related.
Very closely related, and just so it's necessary for our survival.
We have
essentially
to have it.
We have to have it, and it's part of a biological process almost in a way. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that clears up a lot for me. I've got some thoughts around how trying to figure out how just desire in general, but I'll have to come back to that because I just got to think about that for a minute. How to frame that question between ancients and moderns. I'll come back to that though. But thank you for clearing that up, because actually that makes something a lot more clear for me personally. Appreciate it.
Sure. One of the things that he alludes to in this opening section on the medievals, this early summary, is the idea, and he only does it in passing. I'm going to have to look again to find the exact reference, but there is a turn of phrase in here in which he reveals the ancient premise that culture only partially emerges on its own within a group of people over time. Partially, it has to be cultivated by people who have developed spirit in themselves. Without spirit, you can be subject to a culture, but you can't generate a culture. You can pass it on, but you can't innovate. You can create radical experiments, but you can't create healthy, sustainable experiments. The adult faculty of Vernunft, the marrying of gnosis and noesis that generates spirit. Kenneth Smith sees the people in that role, the aristoi, that their job is to help shape culture. Their job is, and the reason is because they're the only ones that are harnessing their mental faculties to the world itself and what the world has to teach them, right? A doulos harnesses himself entirely to his begriff, and a benausos harnesses himself entirely to his Verstand. And in doing that, they cut themselves off from the world. We've talked before about the way they become self-enclosing, and it's a kind of willfulness to be driven by how you feel or to be driven by what you think. What you should be driven by is by what's real. You should use how you feel and how you think to help you sense what's real in the world around you. And that it's only when you pull gnosis and noesis together so that you're firing on both cylinders that you're able to notice in the world around you what's really happening using your gnosis. Even if it contradicts your favorite theories, your gnosis is strong enough not to be blinded by noesis. It's strong enough to sense what's really happening. And that makes it possible for you to bring into your mind fresh information from the world that your noesis can then work on and go, well, what does this mean? This thing that we've seen that I have learned not to ignore. What does it mean? And it's in working through the meaning that you can then figure out where your culture is out of sync with reality. That you go, wow, my culture did not prepare me to understand this. What would I have to change in the culture so that the next generation of people would be better prepared than I was, for how things really are? And this is how it is through the working of Aristoi, the people who cultivate an ancient sense of spirit, that cultures can become more and more adaptive over time. Without those people, if you do what moderns do and you commit characterological genocide to eliminate Aristoi because they're troublemakers who rock the boat, if you try to reduce everything down to noesis and gnosis in their primitive infantile forms, what you get are cultures that drift further and further out of alignment with what they actually need to do in order to be sustainable. They might make sense in their own terms, but they might also destroy the very foundations of their own survival, poisoning their own aquifers, using up their topsoil, poisoning their air. These are the sorts of things that an anti-culture does because it has eliminated the role of the Aristoi to keep tethering you back to reality. And so both of the remaining types of characters, the Banausoi and the Douloi, they're able to drift off wherever the culture goes under its own momentum, separated, increasingly separated from what's obligatory based on nature, and setting up the whole civilization for catastrophe. So when he talks about spirit in here, one of the things that he's talking about is it's part of what makes reading Kenneth Smith tricky, because he'll use a term like spirit and he wants you to understand that this is a term that means different things to different epochs. And if you know what it means to those epochs, then you can tell by the context of the sentence which way he means it. But if you don't know that he means that this has different meanings in different epochs, then you don't know how to read the word. And so you'll be inclined to treat it as a Rorschach test and impose on it whatever meaning feels right to you at the moment that you're reading it, whatever makes sense to you at the moment that you're reading it, which could even be the exact opposite of what he's trying to say. It's why he's hard to read. Sharon, you had your finger up. I'll call on Stephen.
To just very quickly.
Yeah.
Kenneth Smith says spirit is the novel Christian conception of a principle of freedom from nature, freedom over nature.
Yes.
And that's just exactly what you're saying, spirit in a different concept.
Yes. That's the medieval spirit.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's in the third paragraph, very near the bottom, Joseph.
Yes, that's right. And so a sentence like that makes perfect sense when you understand that he's taking a amphibious view and looking at this thing from multiple lenses at the same time. But it doesn't make sense if we just read it as a literal sentence that's somehow expected to have meaning by itself standing alone. Because then, well, do we agree or disagree? We start focusing on whether we agree or disagree with the sentence instead of thinking of it as this is what a medieval would agree with, which is what he's trying to say. This is how a medieval would see the world. They might argue about other things, but this would be one of those core ideas under the surface of the diversity that's helping to unify them, that they're all wrestling with this conception of spirit, whether they agree with it or disagree with it. This is what the argument's about, is whether this is the case. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'll diverge on the issue a bit.
Sure.
Natalia went off for the Black Friday sales on the weekend. And, she went to a world which I've kept away from as the modern, the current modern emporiums, not like the cute little emporiums I knew when I was a teenager back in the 1970s. She says it's like Babylon. And Natalia often points out that, she's interested in philosophy, and her family think it's junk. All the people she meets think philosophy, asking questions, is junk. And their thing is put your head down and immerse yourself in materialism, acquire more and more goods, run around the shops, startled by all the little prizes out there for the monkeys.
Yes.
And this is my worry, that I look at the world, I've looked at the world transform. People were more humble when I was a kid. Today, the arrogance is, grown out of proportion. I remember the 80s where everyone, greed is good. We can all have it all. We'll all work. And it was a relatively peaceful era between some of the major powers. But then finally that period of growth comes to an end in the GFC, and then you see China and America have decided that the world is not big enough for the both of them. And that's where we're headed. We're headed towards conflicts on so many levels.
Yes.
And the conflicts between cultures, they all think that they're it. They all think that the world belongs to them.
Right.
And even individuals, every individual thinks that their dream should come true. Now, of course, we have the example of the medieval monk. The medieval monks were the aristoi that were thrown into the monastery to put them out of the game. And they were taught to subliminate their emotions. And to a certain extent, all medieval society was taught this. A humble society subliminated their emotions.
Right.
Watch out when you really strike emotion, not your pathetic little thoughts, but the emotional drive of the animal that wants it all, that wants to expand. And people think that, no, the technology is going to solve all our problems. This was Malthus's point, and they keep on saying he was wrong. No, he was dead right. Malthus said that that the ability for say something like technology to supply demand and increase in size, it does happen, but it's intermittent. Whereas the human demand for more and growth is constant. Right. And he said that constant is going to overcome the intermittent.
Right.
And people don't understand that. They think, no, technology will solve every problem. And this isn't being looked at. This is not being looked at. The false idol of environmentalism is being put up as a real issue. That's not the issue. The issue is conflict between the human species always. That's going to be the big destroyer. Forget the rest.
Yeah, certainly, at least in the short term, part of what we see happening is things that in a less developed state were survivable and sustainable, when they've developed further and the conflicts have intensified, are getting to a point where everybody's stressed out all the time because there's so much anxiety. When I was a kid in Seattle, anybody could buy a house. It's just anybody could buy a house. You didn't take much to get started, and the total amount wasn't that much related to an annual income. But now nobody can buy a house. I mean, even people with a lot of money in Seattle can't buy houses. It's becoming impossible to live here, and it's the stress is going through the roof for people. Even the people who can live here are spending a higher and higher percentage of their income merely not to be homeless, not to achieve any good thing in the world, or self-enlightenment or happiness or anything, but just literally not to be homeless. They're having to work long hours, and it's nuts, is what it is. It's not a sustainable model. And what it does is it gets people keyed up so that they don't have time to think about the big picture. They don't have time to be nice. They really need to solve the problem of next month's rent, and they have to solve it now by any means. And so they start cutting corners. and how we get along with each other. They start focusing instead on, are you in my way? Are you delaying me from the things I need to do in order to survive? And
Hitler was crazy enough to push the button. Unfortunately, he didn't have the button, or fortunately. And then you had Khrushchev and Kennedy, although one guy said Khrushchev was probably crazy enough, but fortunately you had Kennedy that wasn't that crazy. We lived through an era when they were still a bit steeped in history,
Right.
in the classics.
Right.
And they realised the crazy of pushing the button.
Right.
But we're now living with a more and more Faustian culture,
Yes.
which unless I can have it all, I'm going to push the button.
Yes. Yes. The problem with rocking people back on their limbic system and putting them under stress all the time is they become less intelligent and more extreme. And the more that recipe intensifies, the greater the odds that people will be incompetent to make the decision about whether to push the button. You're absolutely right. One of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about sometimes is how interesting it is to look at the speeches of JFK or Robert Kennedy, and you can see their classical education. You can see that they learned Greek and that they learned Latin and that they read Cicero and that they read Plato. You can see it because of the references. You can tell it's not they might have speech writers, but they have preferences of their own and their personalities come through. When Robert Kennedy, for his eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr., quotes from the Agamemnon, drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. He's talking about, he's talking about the ancient conception of wisdom and pain and how they relate to each other, in order to say that the pain of the loss of Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't have to lead us to be brutal to each other. It can lead us to be wiser and kinder to each other if we can learn the lessons that can be taught here. That's a level of insight that you just don't see from anybody running for office, in the United States anytime in recent decades, and probably for the foreseeable future, because we just don't produce people like that anymore. That's not.
They're all out of Toontown now, like the movie. They all look crazy.
Yeah. So, there are certainly. I think. I can't remember who said this. There's a classical Greek writer who says that we are our biggest problem in the world. That even in that era, before the invention of all the technology that came later, they could already see that most of the problems that Homo sapiens faces are caused by Homo sapiens. We'd gotten to that level of power where we were in our own way, and that's only gotten more intensely so. Since then. Phil, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to start off by answering your question about housing and then expand it, okay? And that's all derived from this equal to the derivatives. The reason why you can't buy a house is because the big money has come in and bought up all the houses because they believe in the future market of the house. Right? And so they're going to hold on to it and release it only when the bidder comes in the right way. So there's an external player that is really playing the futures very hard, which is the derivative.
Right.
And it's all real in a sense.
Yeah.
And that's why you can't buy it at the present, because you ain't got the money to satisfy the derivative. And this ties back to what I've been saying about the moment in art, which, by the way, I also still believe in, but nonetheless I question very deeply, is the moment when finding used to be finding in nature, but when it becomes finding within the frame of reference itself, in the process of the frame within the process, then what happens is that equal to has completely taken over in terms of the metaphysics, because the frame, even to Kant, was the form, but the contents come from elsewhere. And I think what happened is now has become when finding is within the frame of reference itself, the frame becomes both the form and the content. And therefore, in a sense, there is no reference to finding in nature, which is the content. Once it comes up enough, then it begins to transform the frame itself. And so that cycle that leads ultimately back to nature, that refreshes and modifies the frame,
right,
now frozen within self, within,
right,
like it says, the creation of the futures and other derivatives. And I think that's what, I mean, now you think in terms of art, there are these ETFs, right? Within the structure itself. It has nothing to do with some reference outside of itself. So I think that moment was very, very important in terms of finding,
right,
because that's why I kept saying the moment between Cézanne and Picasso, right? Cézanne left many things unsaid because he couldn't quite encapsulate it in the form itself, right? But nonetheless, well, we could solve that problem. Just forget about the things that's outside. It is within the process itself. So I think that doesn't allow for feedbacks coming from elsewhere. And I think that is a problem. That is a problem that I think modernity has gotten to, that in a sense, Hegel certainly allow external reference to come into the content that would transform the culture, the frame, the formal structure of culture. And culture does change because it's modified the externals that comes into the system itself.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So metaphysics is really, it not only wants to be the form, which I think even Plato wants, but also the content. And once it becomes the process of both, like I said, you no longer have to swivel your head.
Right.
You just stare at the frame.
Right. Well, and it's one of the qualities of modernity that it insists that you look at itself, that it turn back upon itself, and that it be thinking about, the reason that we do things is because modernity says, right? Other people are doing X, so we have to do X. Now, we take it for granted because we were raised in this, that's the way things should be. But in the medieval epoch, the reason for doing things was because of God. There was an external reason. You had to look away from your own concerns, and you even had to look away from the concerns of your clergy or your rulers to look and see what God wanted. And it's part of why the medieval epoch had such a problem with heterodoxy, is that the agents who purported to speak for God on earth might say one thing, but somebody else might say, but I don't think that's actually what God wants us to do. And so, maybe I should disobey you and start a little, we'll start a little religious movement where we think that we're getting closer to God because that's the thing that matters. There's this capacity for splitting off to go look at this other frame of reference. So in the ancient epoch, it would be nature. We have learned something new about nature. Some glorious new facet of nature has been discovered, and so we should all go do X now. Whereas, in the medieval epoch, they said, well, that's no excuse. That's not the source of meaning. You don't split away from the established order just because you saw something in nature. That's just a curiosity, something you could tell in a story over a campfire or something. It's only God can be the source. In the modern epoch, of course, having overthrown both those things, it's not a coincidence that we're so self-referential, that we focus so much on the frame, like you're saying, because we've eliminated everything else as a source of meaning. If we discover some new feature of nature, it's only interesting when we can figure out practically how to apply it to make money. It's like, will it entertain people? Will it cure a disease that people will pay the medicine for the medicine? Will it, give us an ability to make a better airplane? What practical purpose does it serve? And if it can be explained in terms of the modernist frame, then we have an interest in it. But if it can't, then we don't, because we don't actually care about nature. We only care about what it will do for us, how it will serve us. And the same goes for if you claim to have discovered some new principle of theology, some new sacred quality of the divine, moderns will mostly look at you like, oh God, here we go again. What fresh hell is this? Some guy's going to try to make us talk about God when what we really want to do is, go to the Black Friday sale and make a killing, right? We're drawn into the frame of modernism, and we sort of have this repulsion against all the things that used to be the sources of meaning in these previous epochs. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, modernity has certainly continued the medieval drive towards hierarchical organization. We just don't have anything at the top, or the person who creates the hierarchical organization gets to be at the top.
Right.
And two, I would say to Phil, since he's going to come up here, that the Chinese remind me a lot. And of course, it's not just the Chinese. It's a comment that was made about the Rockefellers at one time. They only want what's theirs and what's next to theirs. With that sort of driving, with that driving force, everyone wants it all.
Yes.
And they want the hierarchy to be under them. Amway, I guess, is the archetype for modern organization. Well, let's listen to Phil now.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, well, thank you for that reference. I'm Chinese, of course, although I'm quite anti-Chinese in many ways. I want to go to like a late modernist artist who created this thing that has to do with sculpting and illustrating in art all the possibilities of an unfinished square. Not just one piece, but any two or more things. Okay.
Who are you thinking of?
I forgot his name, but it's a late. It's somebody that's related to Solowit, but it isn't. It's somebody. And then there was two critics that was very interesting. Donald Cuspit, who said, this is the manifestation, the realization in physical form of mathematics. Yes. Right? And Rosalind Krauss, who saw it differently, says, no, this is a manifestation of a schizophrenia about a neurosis of the individual. Like he has to now manage and put out every possibility as if he has to complete this in order to whatever. That's pretty much like the final thing of, let's say, reaching into your pocket to make sure that reality is still there, that the stone, you can feel the stone, and it says, oh, okay, to reassure yourself. So that was kind of interesting that one analyzed it as a kind of manifestation of the structure itself, which is, mathematical structure manifested in the frame of reference. The other one was, no, the guy who created is just quite close to schizophrenia. He is so driven in his psychology that she was emphasizing the underneath cause, and he's only looking at the surface structure. Oh, okay, like this is like, okay, the next step to the purification of art to total mathematics, which is very interesting how those two diverge in terms of the criticism, because they could be more different, but they coexisted in completely different understandings of what the meaning of that piece was. I actually side with Rosalind Krauss's interpretation rather than Donald Cuspit, because Donald Cuspit interpretation is the one that's, again, reaffirming the structure of the frame is reaching towards completion, right? Rather than the fact, yes, but there will be a nervous breakdown at the end of this.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm looking at the rest of the section on the medieval worldview, and obviously there is a lot that can be explored here. But whether we need to do it now or whether we can do it as part of the section on medievalism that we're coming to when we eventually get the separate chapters, I'm willing to leave open to people to help decide. I suspect we'll have at least one more session talking about the medieval, because there's a healthy weight of paragraphs here before we get to the modern. And I think it's useful to us to talk about the medieval in its own terms, because in these sessions so far, we've spent so much time critiquing modernism and so much time talking about the ancient worldview. I'd say it's the medieval worldview that we've given short shrift to. What its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, what its relationship is to what came before and what came after. If we're trying to develop all three lens systems for looking at ourselves in the world, it's probably the most underdeveloped of the three, at least for this group. For most moderns, all of the lens systems are underdeveloped except for modernism. But for those of us who've been working on philosophy, I'd say we've put more into understanding the ancient perspective than we have in understanding the medieval perspectives. So maybe next week we take one more stab at establishing the groundwork for medievalism before we move on to the rest of this essay, if you guys are game. It's kind of what I'm thinking about doing. He does more juxtaposition of the animal and the human. He spends some time talking about the capacity for spirit as creating a unique responsibility in human beings, because there are things that we can do that animals can't do, that we can then therefore have expectations that we have a duty to do some of those things, because if we don't do them, they don't get done at all. The cycles, he doesn't go into details, but like one way to think about it is the cycles of extinction that happen on this planet happen for accidentalist reasons. A meteor hits, things change too quickly, species can't adapt, species die. And it may have nothing to do, contrary to Darwinism, it may have nothing to do with fitness. No animal could be expected to be fit to survive inside of volcano lava, or to survive underneath an asteroid that's just crushed you between it and the Earth. That's just not, it's not a fair expectation. And if you get really good at that, it's not going to help you anywhere else, because everything comes at the cost of something else. So there is a certain level of, contrary to what the ancients thought, not all justice can be directly inferred from what we see happening in nature. Some of it, we have to think about nature carefully to understand that what nature is showing us in some cases is justice, and in other cases is a kind of injustice it hasn't managed to develop beyond, and that we might be able to do better than that with the capacities that nature has evolved into us that other animals don't have. But we would then have to take an active role in shaping the world. You see what I mean? You sort of can't expect elk to come up with a concept of justice that could be applied cross species, but you could expect a human being to work on the problem, because what has evolved in us gives us the capacity to think those kinds of thoughts. So there is this question of what is our duty and what is our responsibility, and the medieval world had a specific answer to that question. I mean, our duty is to God primarily, and then to each other secondarily, to help each other find God so that we can all be saved. But if in that animals don't need to be saved because they don't have the choice. They don't have spirit. They didn't have the option of choosing hell or choosing Satan or choosing to disobey God. Their instincts keep them aligned with what it is that they were meant to do as they were designed by God under the medieval schema of the world. But we do have choices, and therefore we can be held accountable, and there can be expectations of us. This kind of notion changes the concept of justice. it changes the concept of justice. One of the things that happened in the ancient world as it entered its senescence, as it got closer to the medieval revolution, we alluded to this before, but I really want to underscore it here because it goes side by side with this question of what can be asked of a human. Is this notion that early in the mythic era of the ancient epoch, we knew that human beings have the capacity for free will, but it has to be cultivated in them. They have a duty to work on cultivating their character, to raise themselves up from the basal metabolism of the mind. But by the time you get to the end, when they're frustrated and depressed, and they've lost confidence in the ancient project, then they start thinking in terms of fatalism. They start thinking your character really is just shackles. And it's that loss of confidence that set them up perfectly to want there to be a medieval revolution, right? Because once you think it's hopeless, then you start dreaming of salvation. It's the people who know they're never going to be a millionaire that want to gamble the most. Because what do they have to lose? They're already poor. They don't think they're ever going to be rich unless something lucky happens. They need some surprising good news. And so the surprising good news that all of these things that have been holding you down don't matter because Jesus can let you out of it. Jesus can clear the demons. He can remove the impediments and you can be saved forever. It's exactly the kind of message you want to hear when you stop believing that you can be the architect of your own character, when you start believing that you're trapped and that there's nowhere to go. And that not only are you trapped by your personal character, your civilization is trapped by its civilizational character. Your city is trapped by the city's character. You start to believe that there's these layers of shackles that are keeping you in and that there's no way out. And that's why Gilbert Murray called it the loss of nerve late in the ancient epoch. They were primed for something. So the point is, all of this goes hand in hand with this conception of what are the duties of Homo sapiens? What are our responsibilities? And they should, and therefore, what is the nature of justice? We haven't talked about this a lot, but the entire framework for axiology, for deciding right and wrong, changes dramatically as a result of this change in the conception of human character, human spirit, the purpose of it, the nature of the gods, how do we fit into the schema? It almost, if you knew all of the premises of medievalism except for the moral premises, and you thought about them deeply enough, you would end up reinventing the medieval moral premises because they follow naturally from the framework that they've put in place. They've created, in Hegelian terms, an organismic whole of a culture. And obviously that's not something you just sit down and draft on a drafting board in one lifetime. It's something that took a long time, iteratively, incrementally, experimentally to develop during the late stages of the Roman Empire. But it did develop and it did cohere and hold together. And it's worth digging into because it's an organic whole. I think I'm going to do Joseph, then Phil, then Stephen. So go ahead, Joseph.
Mine's going to be a very brief question. So it'll be, what did, as far as like having domain, like the ability to form your own character, did the Greeks say anything specific that you can recall about environment? Or not even, the ancients anyway, as far as how the environment impacts one's character and even their ability to even form their character based on, because I think about this in terms of modern decision making.
So you talked about not just the natural environment, but the cultural environment?
Yes.
Yeah.
If it's too far off, and we can come back to it another time. It's just something I've thought about.
Put a book reference.
Oh, cool.
Werner Jaeger, Paideia, volumes 1 through 4. He's got a 4-volume set of books in which and it's been years, but he's still the main reference on this topic. What did the ancient Greeks think about the relationship between the environment and character? What were the duties of culture toward cultivating human beings? This notion of anthropoculture. He writes about it extensively, and he traces it all the way from the ancient conception of Paideia to the Christian conception of Paideia. He traces it through the revolution and shows you on both sides of it, comparison and contrast. How did they see things? They're quite good. I
Thank you.
Recommend.
Thank you.
And
so
I
much
got them from Kenneth. He recommends those books.
Fantastic. So, thank you for that.
Sure. It's one of my favorite subjects, which is why I'm not going to cover it in the last minutes, because I would go on and on and on.
I think about that in terms of choice theory and everything, how we make our decisions, and even what do we really have control over.
Exactly. So exactly. It's just fascinating stuff.
It is. Thank you.
Sure. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems to me, before you explain it further, that the deep structure of medievalism is the transcendental nature of God, the transcendental nature of justice and all that.
Yes.
And prior to your thing, I'm now rethinking Kant. I've always thought Kant was his attempt to save Plato. But now I'm beginning to think that maybe he is really attempting to save the medieval God of the transcendental, right? And he has it in a sense where human beings are given, according to the medievals, some sense of will and freedom and spirit, you know, and that Kant actually talks about that in a sense, the manifestation of practical reason, right? In other words, maybe not transcendental reason, but practical reason. It seems to me that's a limited expression within the transcendental reason.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe he is trying to save that now. Before the Christians, maybe before the Jews, but I don't know. But the Christians certainly, there was no transcendental being. Possibly you could say Parmenides, but that was an idea. Well, that was not a being. Okay. And Parmenides was sort of thought of, but wasn't really obey in the Greek period. So in some sense,
outlier.
That's right. He was an outlier. So in some sense, that was a fundamental foundation that's different. And now I'm thinking, well, maybe Kant is not so much saving Plato because he is saving the medievals, right? Because he talked about the transcendental quite a bit.
That's right.
All right.
That's right. That's astute. That's well put. And it goes hand in hand with Donald's defense of Plato from a couple of weeks ago. That, Kenneth especially attributes a lot of things to Plato that in fairness, we should really attribute to what the medievals did to Plato rather than to Plato himself. And so in the same sense, I think you're right that we can tie Kant to the medieval perspective. In fact, Hegel as well, even in attempting to correct Kant and make his philosophy more naturalistic and organic. At the exact same time, there are certain tables Hegel doesn't want to overturn. Hegel still has a fairly medieval form of Christianity. I mean, not full-blown medievalism, of course, but I mean, strands of medievalism continue to the present day within various Christian sects. Some a lot, and some not very much, but it's still around, and it was certainly around in Hegel's time. And there are places where Hegel argues where it reminds you of the medieval theologians who are attempting to organize their logic in such a way that they won't accidentally reach a blasphemous conclusion, because they know certain answers are right and certain answers are wrong, and you're free to think whatever you want as long as you end up at the right answer. But if your lines of thinking should take you outside that frame, you could be burned at the stake. So there's this way in which, once you're sensitive to it, if you pick some one area of philosophy that you're really good at, that you're really interested in, and you trace it all the way from modernism through medievalism through the ancients, you'll find how, when it's going through the medieval period, they work so hard to bend it to get to certain preordained conclusions. A priori reasoning, where you decide in advance what your target has to be, rather than letting the subject matter guide you, is one of the fingerprints of medieval philosophy. They need to end with the right answers. And you can see how early modern philosophers are only partly pulling themselves free from that. They feel excited and exhilarated because they're reaching farther than their predecessors. But you'll see that they only do that on the subjects that they themselves feel it's okay to not know what the answer is going to end up being. If it's one of the core values that they have, they will continue doing the medieval thing and will bend their argument away from whatever trajectory it would have honestly had to make sure that it arrives at the point, whether that was justified or not, by the way they're exploring it. So there are places in Hegel where he violates his own dialectics in order to get to the right answer, because he's prepared to question many things, but not everything. And that's a medievalism, that the frame is determined in advance and all your reasoning has to end up in certain places. The answers, to go to what I think Stephen was saying earlier, one of the characteristics is that the answer, as moderns care more about the answers because medievals cared more about the answers. You have to know in advance what the answer is, and then you sort of backfill the logic and questions in order to make sure you get there. So anyway, Stephen, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up the cartoon again, Much Ado About Nothing, the one about the little squirrel that he's running along looking for something, and then he comes across some peanuts and he's pretty excited, but he keeps on seeing every bigger nut and he's got to go for it. Well, maybe squirrels won't do that, but humans will. They're unscripted.
Yes.
And as soon as they're presented with a huge new possibility, I want that. You know, when they didn't know about it, they were cool, they were fine. When they lived in a set of limited circumstances, I have my little world, I have my little objectives, not so bad. And then it learns that there's new big objectives out there and it cannot resist.
Yes.
Where is this going to end up? Like the arrogance today, it's like this business with the coronavirus. The technocrats today think they can defeat the virus. It's already, well, this class of virus, they already tried that post-World War II. Who knows, maybe they'll succeed today. They failed post-World War II. They thought they could wipe out the flu with mass immunisation. It failed spectacularly. So much so it even undid what they were trying to do. They've discovered by trying to immunise everybody, the flu just evolved past it and went and attacked the very people they wanted to protect, those who were compromised and the medical workers, which they thought, well, actually the smart thing would have been just to immunise the vulnerable and the medical workers and leave the rest of the population. But today, the technocrat, in the older science fiction, that we were always warned about the Faustian technocrat. This guy is crazy. This is the mad scientist. Watch out. But today, we've gone opposite. We're worshipping the mad scientist,
yes.
technocrat.
Yes.
Watch out. These guys are only monkeys with a box of matches.
And sticks of dynamite. Yes. You know, setting aside the question of COVID, just generally speaking, technophilia is definitely one of the diseases of the modern era. We keep being seduced by the idea that if we had more power, it would solve all our problems. Many of the problems being caused by the current level of power that we have. That people who shouldn't be wielding power are wielding power. We're like, well, the solution to this too much power problem is definitely more power. So, you know, if we come up with faster computers and cleverer AIs, once we have robot soldiers who don't have any, you know, compassion or values, then, and they can kill anyone they want to, then the world will be a safe, peaceful place. And we do this with every field. You know, we do this about transportation. We do, you know, voting, right? It's like, you know, well, we can't let people vote with a pencil and a piece of paper. That's just horrible. We need a computer, and a computer will make voting better so that it can let them mark the little boxes and we can count them at the end using a computer. Of course, you don't need a computer to vote, but you do need a computer to corrupt the vote and not be detected doing it, because it's an awful lot of flexibility for something that really just needs to be boxes on a piece of paper. But we can't resist throwing technology at a problem, even if the problem is mostly, self-solving or what have you. I come out of the computer science field, and the worship of technology is rampant. There is a widespread belief that every problem can be solved with more technology, including problems that have nothing to do with it.
I appreciate this, and I'm off now to meet God in the metaverse.
Enjoy. Yeah, we're just wrapping up here.
Yeah, but remember, like, you could make a call, but you could also make a put in the market.
Right.
Just remember that. So it really does come down to your choice.
NFT in my own image.
Right. Well, I had a great time, everybody. This was a fun week, and we'll do some more. We'll go medieval some more next week.
Right.
There you go.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Have a good day.
Okay, which page do you suggest most of all for next week?
So I think the place that I'm probably going to focus is the paragraph that begins, "That is what man's modicum of spirit means," that he's architected to take responsibility. That's
okay. Which page is that?
That's under medieval, third paragraph.
That's page 2, is it?
I believe so.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah.